What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 2. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. The 11th Regiment began marching northeast as soon dawn broke. Mounted on a mongoose lizard, AZULA rode alongside Xing and Mosey on their own reptile mounts at the head of the regiment. Kai's battalion was immediately behind them, followed by Ren's, Weikong, Ping, and finally Rufin. Looking over her shoulder, the princess had to admit that the line of soldiers in deep red and black with spears and banners bobbing up and down made for a rather impressive sight. Xing had decided to modify the old regiment's banner, interestingly adopting a black scorpion for himself, sat under Li Dai's own gold-yellow phoenix, displayed and expanded. Of course, the royal flame was placed above both of them as a sign of AZULA's favor. The colonel's choice for an emblem aside, it is good that he honors Colonel Li Dai, Governor Day had remarked on seeing the banners. It reminds friends and enemies alike of the nature of the force they face, and gives time for Colonel Xing to build his own reputation. As much as the nobles back home snubbed him, Colonel Li Dai seemed to have left a mark in the colonies. Well, in Zilong at the very least. The subtleties, or lack thereof, of emblem placement was of little interest to AZULA, but she did note its significance amongst those in the know. Perhaps the Earth Kingdom would also understand the nuances of the banners. Hopefully she'll find out soon enough. The march out east was largely uneventful, though it was interesting hearing the regiment's marching song. The tune was unfamiliar, but the lyrics were rather uplifting. "I don't recognize the song," she had said, and it was Mosey who answered with some awkwardness. Colonel Xing introduced the tune, along with several others. AZULA glanced at Xing, who was pretending not to listen. "Is that so?" She didn't bother trying to ask any further. Xing would probably shrug it off, and everyone would say it's the spirits again. Other than that, AZULA learned about the inconveniences of military camping. Though her tent was considered lavish compared to what everyone else was sleeping in, she found the bedding to be too thin and the smells and sounds of the camp to be too distracting. It took a full week before the princess got used to the rough conditions. And of course there was the primitiveness of latrines and the lack of proper baths. Water was prioritized for cooking and the far too rare laundering. And this was a regiment with optimal supplies. It must have been truly remarkable that Xing and the others survived with scraps before this. Still, roughing it with the soldiers had its perks. By now, AZULA had to admit some fondness for the company of the officers and the semi-formal respect the soldiers gave her. They bowed lightly in her presence, never letting it stop them from continuing their tasks unless ordered otherwise. But the respect in their voices as they addressed her was far preferable to the scraping sycophants and patronizing sneers in the palace. There was little to no fear of her amongst the 11th Regiment, but it was an acceptable trade-off. If anything, AZULA still envied how casually the veteran soldiers treated their colonel. Xing was far less uptight than he was back in the capital, and ignored the breaches of decorum when he mingled with the older soldiers. They patted him on the back, ruffled his hair, hugged, or in Kai's case, bear-hugged him. AZULA stamped down those thoughts before it could threaten to overtake her rational mind. The affection of the regiment to its colonel was intriguing and nice, but she was a princess after all, and royal distance, royal strength had to be maintained. Though perhaps someday. Not for the first time AZULA shook her head to banish the stubborn line of thinking, and distracted herself on other issues, like the prisoner carts between the battalions. It was surprising to see the Water Tribe and Earth Kingdom occupants sitting obediently without chains or stocks, chatting with their guards as if they were just guests. The casual handling of the supposedly valuable prisoners was a slap to the face of conventional doctrine. Yet the 11th had no recent reports of attempted escapes. She did notice Xing seeing to them every time they set up camp, and heard the muted conversations within their tents. There was unmistakable joviality in the voices, a casual banter like that amongst old colleagues. It was puzzling, but the princess decided to leave it to the regiment. If a prisoner was caught trying to escape, then she'd happily dress down Xing and the other officers. A sudden stray thought wriggled and screamed in her head. Not that she would mind having Xing dressing down for her. "Are you all right, princess?" a bodyguard asked with some concern as she coughed heavily at the thought. I'm fine." Why did she have to think that? AZULA hurried into her tent with orders not to be disturbed. She didn't dare look at the mirror or touch her face. Why did she have to imagine Xing standing before her and getting out of his armor and his clothes and high arg? She was doing it again. She needed to redirect the weirdness, needed to find something else to focus on. AZULA popped out of her tent no less than 5 seconds after entering, and her guards were professional enough not to question her about it. "Find me the colonel," she ordered. "Tell him I need to train." It was a great idea indeed. Not only did the weird thoughts go away for the time being, but there was a satisfaction to be had from sparring with Xing, even if she inevitably lost. The cheers and commiseration from onlookers was nice, but the rush of combat against him, that was nicer. Regardless, she didn't get to ponder the new turn of emotions for too much. 15 days after leaving Zilong, AZULA found something to look forward to. Scouts have reported an Earth Kingdom army of some size pushing west, Xing announced in the command tent. "We don't know their destination just yet." The boy paused and gave a lopsided grin. "But I suppose there's only one way to find out, right?" The air was thick with anticipation as the 11th Regiment readied for battle. It was rather amusing having Mosey stop and remind Xing that he was a colonel now and had no reason to join the scouts. That left the boy fidgeting anxiously in the command tent and muttering to himself as he stared at the map. Ren couldn't blame him for the nerves. It will be Xing's first time truly leading the regiment after all. And there's also a watching princess to impress. "Relax, Xing, we've done this before," Ren said, though it only earned a drawn-out sigh from the colonel. "We've got new people with us. Untested. They'll do their jobs. That's what we've been training them up for, right?" Xing gave a reluctant nod, and then stared at the map once more. "Here's to hoping the new lieutenants and sergeants don't mess up," he thought aloud. Ren rolled her eyes as she walked over to give him a comforting hug from behind. "Relax. We'll make sure to keep a tight leash on them. We've done so before when we were learning your ideas, remember?" But Ren dug her chin on Xing's head to interrupt him. He shifted, but she held him tight enough that he couldn't escape. "No, you're worrying too much again. We're soldiers. We know what we've signed up for. You've led us before. This time shouldn't be any different other than us actually having to call you, sir. And I know at least that you're not going to send us to our deaths." She felt his body expand and contract in one big exhale. "You're right. I'm sorry, Ren." Ren let out a soft giggle at how adorable her little brother sounded. "It's all right. Can't have my colonel's judgment so clouded that you start planning for failure, right? I understand. Now, could you let go of me?" "No." Xing, the damned Kai had to enter just at that moment, and after quickly recovering from the surprise, he scowled at her. "Ren, let go of the colonel." "I'm just reassuring our Xing here," Shinon answered. "I'm fine now, Ren," Xing spoke up. "You can stop reassuring me." With a sigh and a pout, Ren released her little brother and stuck her tongue out at Kai for ruining the comfy moment. Xing straightened his clothes and caught Kai's attention before the captains could devolve into bickering. "What were you saying, Kai?" "Oh, right. The sentries on the north spotted some Earth Kingdom scouts. Mosey has sent a team to try catching them, but there's a good chance they'll escape." Ren's face screwed up into a grimace. There went the advantage of surprise. Xing simply nodded and glanced back to the map. "Whether we get them or not, we'll start moving out once the team and rest of the scouts return." "Night march?" Kai asked. Xing nodded and pointed at the map. "To reposition ya. Regardless of where they're going, there's going to be a forest in their way. Might as well intercept them with the woods behind our backs." Mosey led the other captains and lieutenants in, along with an intrigued Princess AZULA. This would be her first time sitting in on a proper planning session, after all. The lieutenant colonel was the one to bring the meeting into order. Immediately, the casual air hanging about was discarded, and the officers settled into a comfortable tension. "Colonel, no signs of flares, so our scouts should be returning by the evening as estimated." The princess tilted her head in a quizzical fashion. "Flares? in case our teams are severely compromised or something requires the regiment to immediately move. The fire-bending scouts are supposed to release a bolt of fire in the air, Mosey helpfully explained without missing a beat. Failing which, the non-benders would have a portable firework launcher to serve the same purpose. And the hunting party? Xing asked, refocusing the meeting. Ping shook her head. No news, but given how much of a lead the Earth Kingdom scouts had, it's safe to assume that our teams will return empty-handed. Some sighs filled the tent, but nobody was too dejected about it. Rin much preferred the fights to be fully on the regiment's terms, but issues like this were expected. Xing squinted at the map before them, and Run could almost hear the gears cranking in his head. The initial report, it estimates 6,000. About there, Mosey confirmed with a nod. 2 noticeably different banners, so at least 2 separate forces combined. There's been no news of new Earth Kingdom strategies and tactics? Not since Zilong, Colonel. The Colonel hummed thoughtfully. We're just over 1,500, not including support staff. He continued to stare at the map for a moment, and then broke into a familiar grin. I say it's close enough to a fair fight. They could use 1,000 more to even things out. But what can we do, right? Ruin and the others chuckled along, while the princess and the newer lieutenants looked a bit confused. Fair, sir. Lieutenant Toshi, quite cute, just too rural for Ren's tastes, politely asked. Oh, don't worry, Kai answered with a dashing grin. We've had worse odds before. Xing nodded firmly. Remember your training and briefings. This regiment built its reputation by beating back larger forces in worse conditions. Just do as you're ordered. And at worst, we'll only have to carry out an organized withdrawal. Toshi and his greener colleagues were far from persuaded, but they wisely kept their silence for now, until the scouts returned with more detailed information. Any protest would be pointless. Rin noticed Princess AZULA simply watching in silence with a small smirk tugging at her lips. The regiment briskly decamped, and by the time the hunting team returned with no success and the scouts brought back valuable intelligence, the 11th began to move northwards for the night. Xing and the captains huddled in a makeshift command cart, picking out the details, while lieutenants rode alongside and tried their best to listen in while providing illumination with their fire-bending. Almost 7,000 strong, Kai commented on the updated numbers. Rin didn't hide her excited grin as the lead scout gave more information. Mostly levies, at most 2/3, around a corps of actual soldiers, no cavalry. Levies led the way, as usual. The foot soldiers were marching around the commanders. Banners say 2 generals are leading, with a few lesser commanders. Maybe 2-3 colonels, judging from the different house guard armors. Their earthbender squads were spread out throughout the ranks as usual. Mosey hummed before he asked the important question. Did they notice you? The scout shook his head. If they did, they made a good show about ignoring us. Their perimeter security was lacking, as usual. Still haven't updated their doctrine, it seems. I've got a team shadowing them in the meantime. Dark chuckles broke out at the Earth Kingdom's incompetence. How many years has it been? And how many more would it take before they finally adopted better scouting practices for their marches? Well, if they're going to be lax about it, I'm not going to complain, Xing said, voicing everyone's thoughts. Now, their path west allows them to hit a good number of colonies. With their numbers, it'd be less of a raid and more of a raise. The colonel looked to the lead scout. Standard marching pattern. The man nodded, the shadows dancing sinisterly over his smirk. Their supply caravan was lightly defended, probably earthbenders so they can hide behind dirt walls. If they're sticking to old doctrine, the guards won't change much once they settle down. Unguarded supplies. Wakong breathed out. They'll probably keep the same arrangement once they settle down. Assuming they haven't learned, Mosey cautioned. You'll be striking at their supplies? Princess AZULA, who had been silently watching until now, asked. Since the enemy outnumbers us, we'll go for easy targets. Supplies and leadership, if possible. Otherwise, we'll whittle them down. The princess frowned, but her voice held curiosity rather than doubt. How do you plan to do that? Xing broke into that unnerving grin of his whenever he was looking forward to one-sided battles. With precise and overwhelming applications of violence, Your Highness, he indicated at the map as he elaborated on his plans. Their army is crossing the plains for as long as they can. Standard practice, since open ground, is better for earthbenders than forests. We'll do a night march to reach here, at the edge of the forest, and use the time to set up. Why engage them in the open? Why not just lure them into the forest? Run felt a bout of nostalgia at the princess' words. It was almost exactly what she and the others had asked Xing the first time he brought up such a plan. Looking at her grinning colleagues, it seemed that they felt the same way too. Because princess making them fight in unfavorable terrain makes them far more alert than if they fought on what they think are favorable grounds. Something I noticed about the Earth Kingdom armies. Earth bending in the open is dangerous, but very limited, very predictable, especially at range. And there are less variables to worry about. No falling trees and such. The princess nodded slowly, getting some idea of what Xing had in mind. You're making them fight in conditions they're more comfortable with, just to make them more complacent. Xing nodded. Coupled with the fact that they clearly outnumber us, it's a safe bet that the commanders would either be more reckless or, if they're experienced, more cautious when dealing with us because they fear a trap. Kai huffed. If they're really smart, they'd turn tail and leave. At the princess' disbelieving look, Xing shrugged. It worked before, considering the Fire Nation's record of theater-wide advances. Some of their generals might be wary of being drawn into an encirclement. I see. And judging from her face, she really was thinking about it. Rin almost sighed, wishing her lieutenants had that same level of comprehension back in training. Days wasted just to beat basic common sense into their head. Xing continued, drawing an imaginary line at the edge of the destination with his finger. So we make it to the edge of the woods as fast as we can, and how long we've got to set up before they arrive will determine the appropriate stratagems to use. With their scouts escaping us, there's a good chance our window of opportunity will be shorter, but not too short, Ping cheerfully said. Regardless, once the Earth Kingdom army sees us there, they'll likely set up camp and prepare to face us. Xing then gave the princess a bright grin. On the off chance they're stupid enough to send a vanguard against us, I'll be sure to allot some of them for you, Your Highness. More laughter broke out from the cart, and those close enough to hear the words. Yeah, we can't have our royal patron missing out on the fun, Ruffin remarked drily. We'll keep the choice officers for Your Highness to claim, Ping added. Give the folks back home something to sing about. Princess AZULA blinked in confusion at first, but then grinned just as savagely as Xing and nodded. I appreciate the offer, but if the enemy is stupid enough to allow for that, they'd be unsuitable trophies for a royal princess. Everyone laughed as the regiment's royal patron got into the spirit. Besides, she added once the laughter calmed, that would rely on them sending out their vanguard in the first place, right? Xing shrugged. Yes, princess, though you'd be surprised how often it happens, even on our side. With high spirits, the scouts ranged out once more, and the 11th Regiment marched into the night, making good time thanks to drilled-in discipline amongst the newbies and the scouts leading the way. They stopped only for 4 hours' sleep on bedrolls, and then continued once dawn broke. It took the end of the evening before they arrived at their new campsite, and Mosey wasted no time in organizing the camp's defenses while Xing busied himself, helping the quartermaster, and the smiths set up a workshop to no doubt start working with the novel materials. While Kai's 1st Battalion helped with the defenses, Run and the other captains hammered in last-minute training to the Green troops to wear out most of their pre-battle nerves. A peaceful, restful night followed, and it was only by late afternoon that some scouts brought back news of the enemy's progress. They're moving slower than expected. Might have been worried when their scouts discovered our camp that time. Makes sense, Xing replied. Not something to complain about. How many days have we got? The grizzled Pathfinder shrugged. 2 more days, give or take. Earthbenders break camp faster than us after all. Good. Go get your sleep. The scout saluted and promptly left to find him and his team the comfortable batch of tents purposely left for them. Considering how hard they were worked, it was only fair they got some extra privileges. Also, nobody wanted sloppy Pathfinders. Princess AZULA keenly studied everything that was going on around her, asking pertinent questions about the basic fortifications as soldiers felled trees for a palisade, dug a trench to delay earthbenders for just a little while, or erected a basic watchtower behind the tree-line. The 2 days were well spent, with firebenders and spearmen alike being drilled and then given ample rest. Reinforced foraging teams hunted down the surrounding wildlife, as much to bolster the regiment's supplies as to process their sinew and bones for materials. Earth Kingdom scouting parties were exterminated when convenient, but otherwise ignored. The regiment's own scouts rotated to keep track of the Earth Kingdom army, who were marching faster and longer, no doubt realizing there was a welcoming party awaiting them. Those returning delivered the latest updates about the enemy's composition. Their earthbenders outnumbered the regiment's firebenders only about 3-1, and while the army's morale appeared high, the scouts noticed that the levies were a bit more bedraggled than the rest of the forces. It could be that their access to supplies could be more restricted, Xing guessed. It was known that some Earth Kingdom nobles jealously hoarded their supplies for use in their own personal household guard, and only the barest minimum was rationed out to their allies. That selfishness made supply raising all the more effective, as mutual resentment could easily be escalated into infighting. Thank the spirits the Fire Nation had left such petty practices long ago. Princess AZULA scowled at learning that possibility. How is it that nobody back in the capital mentioned this? It's not something so obvious that needs consideration, Xing answered with a shrug. We only discovered it because of our extensive scouting. Our armies have little reason to bother thoroughly investigating why the opposition they face are so easily trampled. Not when even the Earth Kingdom officers are reluctant to admit their practices. And there's the fact that a lot of the reports Colonel Li Dai sent back home were intercepted by his rivals. Rin was more than happy to add. Otherwise, we wouldn't be as good at roughing it out with limited supplies as we are now. Despite Xing's weary sigh, Rin was happy to see the princess glowering at her words. I see. Perhaps father should have been more strict in reforming the court's reach. Well, in any case, it shouldn't be an issue we'll have anytime soon, Xing said with a resolute nod, and then bowed to the princess. We have your highness to thank, of course. Rin and the others bowed as well, and it was adorable how surprised the princess looked. Well, she sputtered, at least you know how lucky you are. It took all of Ren's willpower to not smack Xing over the back of his head when he rolled his eyes. By the time the banners of the Earth Kingdom army came into view in the afternoon, the 11th Regiment had hunkered down as well as they could. For many veterans like Kai, seeing the larger force milling about before pulling back to set up camp was rather reassuring. It almost felt like the bloody old days again. Xing stared at the enemy camp, and then gave an order that was once a familiar request. Get the Earth Kingdom prisoners up here, including Yama, Ping asked almost by rote. The boy smirked as he went through the regiment's little ritual. No, Yama's been with us too long, he said aloud, drawing chuckles and grins from those in the know. Old Coot probably can't tell between Ba Sing Se and Omasha by now. I heard that, you insolent brat, came the expected reply from the prisoners' tents. Right on cue. Despite that, General Yama was brought out along with the others to have a look at the banners. Recognize any of them? Xing asked. The prisoners squinted and exchanged mutters, but only one, a young captain, seemed to have some idea. The banner with the ice mountain. It looks similar to the emblem of Duke Li of Qinbao. Family? Mosey asked. The captain shrugged, but a scarred lieutenant spoke up. Duke Li has no sons old enough to fight, but it could be his younger brother. There was a thoughtful hum for a moment before Xing asked, if that's the Duke's younger brother, how much do we want to keep him alive? The captain spoke up again. Duke Li and his brother are close, but everyone says the Duke spoils his only family, which in turn makes the brother a challenge to work with. Kai and his colleagues chuckled at that, while Xing gave an amused nod. So, you guys probably won't like him sticking around for too much. Got it. The prisoners were returned to their camp. The Yama pool was raised yet again. It was growing to the point where if the old badger mole ever identified a banner, the winners would be able to buy a comfortable life in the colonies, and everyone eagerly awaited Xing's next orders. We've got a few hours before sundown. Koshi Kai, prepare for a parley. Just in case they're reasonable. Mosey, make sure everyone stays on their toes. Kai didn't bother to hide his triumphant grin over a pouting Run as he went off to assemble his battalion. In short order, Kai and some hand-picked soldiers joined Koshi and the bodyguards to form a respectable honor guard behind Xing and Mosey. The lieutenant colonel carried a flag of truce as they marched out into the plains. Movement was detected across the Earth Kingdom camp, and soon they too had a large group moving out under a white flag. Xing had everyone stop at roughly the halfway point between the two camps, and they waited patiently for their opposite number to arrive. Kai could make out two generals, a gaggle of high-ranking commanders and heavily armed guards, all on ostrich horses. Impressive, if not for the clashing color schemes from each commander and their color-matched guards. The Earth Kingdom party came to a stop at a respectable distance away, enough for them to quickly dismount and start throwing rocks if things went dicey. Kai noticed their surprise as they saw Xing. The young colonel greeted first, offering a polite nobleman's salute. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am Colonel Xing of the Fire Nation's 11th Regiment. Thank you for coming out to meet us." One of the generals, a lean, neatly groomed man that bore an air that screamed aristocrat, gave a derisive snort. The Ice Mountain emblem was proudly etched on his armor. Probably Duke Li's brother, or possibly even a favored champion. "Come to discuss your surrender, boy?" The other general, an older, gruffer man with a milky, scarred eye, raised a hand to hold back his colleague, eyeing the Fire Nation group warily. His armor was more worn and lacking any insignia. A lesser noble, or a smart man, or both. "I know of the defiant 11th. I know of you, boy. We thought you dead at last." Even with Xing's back facing him, Kai could imagine the colonel's wide smile. "Ah, fortunately for us, we are too stubborn to simply be buried. I'm sorry if that inconveniences you." The older general scowled, while some of the colonels and captains behind him expressed similar displeasure. "Say your piece then, and let us be done with this useless meeting." Xing gave another polite bow and salute. "I am here to warn you against trespassing any further. If you know of us, of my regiment, then you should know of what we are capable of." "Nonsense," the younger general shouted. "Your little band is clearly outnumbered. Don't think whatever reputation you claim to have is going to scare us away. Even if you think to trap you dash, whenly enough," his co-commander cut in sternly before fixing a glare at Xing, "you are greatly outnumbered, boy. And whatever tricks you think to play will not work on me." Great, a hardy boulder of a commander. His men would probably be just as stubborn. Kai frowned at the realization that there would likely be a lot of bloodshedding to get things resolved. "Hopefully the princess isn't too squeamish. I will have to refuse your offer, General." With no reply from the scowling man for a few seconds, Xing continued on. "But since battle between us is inevitable, know that we will accept any surrender given honestly." Kai heard his little brother's voice harden to a cold edge. "Also, know that until such a surrender is received, we will use any means at our disposal to defeat you." While the scarred general continued to scowl, his younger counterpart chuckled with heavy amusement. "Kids these days, run along back, boy. I'll see if I can get my warriors to not go too hard on you." With the parley ended, Kai noticed Xing tensing up as he marched back at a fast pace. "This might be a bloody fight. You think they'll be that dangerous?" Xing nodded. The one-eyed general might be at least. He was wary of us, instead of dismissive. Kai nodded his agreement at that thought, and felt himself frown at the effort needed to break a stubborn opponent. About halfway back, Kai took a glance over his shoulder and saw signs of heavy activity from the Earth Kingdom army. By the time they returned to camp, Mosey and the other captains were ready to receive new orders. Xing wasted no time in giving out orders. "Welcoming phalanx. Have the troops pace themselves. They outnumber us enough to afford reserves. Distribute naphtha jars across the battalions. Have the princess back at a safe distance, at least until the skirmishing is over." "What's the rules of engagement?" Ruffin asked. "Standard. None of them warrant headhunting, and none are that special that we need them alive." As Kai and the others organized their battalions, Xing hurried off to the workshop to break out the toys. It seems that there was a downside to being well known. AZULA watched as the regiment exploded in a flurry of activity. All the good cheer from previous days replaced with steely discipline and determination. Soldiers hurried outside the camp, officers and sergeants bellowed orders, and camp followers helped to lug out crates of clay pots. Several of the smaller supply carts were still at the workshop, surrounded by smiths busy adding some sort of boxy things on them. Xing was with his bodyguards and the quartermaster rolling a large metal tube, taller than a man, out of the camp. Those that weren't helping with the tube were straining themselves dragging heavy crates. Thanks to her own bodyguards and the few soldiers tasked to help them, the princess was kept back, and so couldn't see what was going on beyond the palisades. She felt annoyed, more than annoyed, at being held inside and without a clear view. Worse, the men and women she passed by had the gall to put on a cheery face to reassure her. She was no fool, and could see the nerves hiding underneath their masks. She could sense their tension, much like a simpering court attendee awaiting the Fire Lord's verdict. It was troubling to see these soldiers, her soldiers, actually going out to meet the enemy. Why did that notion unsettle her so? They were all talented and well-trained. They wouldn't do something so crass like flee from battle and dishonor the royal patronage she'd invested in them. She shouldn't be so weak with worry. Xing was leading them, after all. And why did it trouble her even more to know that Xing was also out there? You better not do something stupid like die, Xing. AZULA heard herself mutter under her breath. Sergeant Han, better known within his unit as Araka Han to differentiate him from the other Hans, stood at attention directly behind the colonel on a raised platform. It was a perk of being the leader of the Han unit. That perk also meant that the sergeant had a clear view of the approaching enemy formations. He wasn't sure if they were out in full force, but he would believe it if that was the case. It was his first taste of combat, and Han would freely admit that the Earth Kingdom army was more than a little impressive. It was impressive enough that he began to doubt Colonel Xing's breezy confidence. Full overwatch, he heard the captains call out as the enemy reached a certain point, and the firebenders across the battalions assumed combat stances. The Earth Kingdom army suddenly slowed, and it took a second for Han to squint and see that the things suddenly lifting up into the air were large boulders that were flying towards him. Bolts of fire flew out in response, blasting away the rocky projectiles with ease, as if they were the practice stone piles back in the training grounds. Some were exploded close enough that the line was showered in a light pattering of burnt dirt. Han heard some complaints about unlucky bits of dirt hitting their eyes, but that was about the extent of the damage from the Earth Kingdom's volleys. Lieutenant Colonel Mosey and Lieutenant Koshi stood unmoving, and the colonel stood between them, standing by a large metal pipe, shifting his head slightly to take in the battle. The bodyguards only exploded into motion to efficiently shoot down any rocks that they perceived to be a threat to their position. It takes about 3 or 4 earthbenders to throw a rock that far, the colonel remarked suddenly through his mail-veiled helmet. Maybe more if they're not properly trained. At least 2 to gather up and compact the ground into a solid enough mass, and an extra bender or more to help put enough force in the throw for such a distance. So instead of overwhelming us, our firebenders are only a little overworked from intercepting about 1 boulder each. The colonel's head turned just a little, enough for Han to realize that the words were meant for him and the other new additions to the regiments. So don't worry too much. You've been training for this. A portion of the Earth Kingdom army stopped to unleash a cloud of arrows into the skies. Again, the firebenders took care of the incoming attack, with only a few benders required to project a huge curtain of fire that incinerated and scattered the arrows harmlessly away. They're sending out the first wave, Lieutenant Colonel Mosey stated plainly. Levies anchored around soldiers. The colonel nodded. Try to stick us from the front while our firebenders are busy with Overwatch. Good idea, but they should have added some earthbenders with them. As the young commander chuckled, Han felt himself infected with his confidence and good spirits, as if he was also in on the joke. Mosey napped the slingers. I'll leave it to your discretion. Han's nose instinctively twitched with distaste as he recalled the training for that particular weapon. The captains just shoved them squad by squad into a shack and lit up the mixture of powdered dung and other noxious ingredients inside, then locked the door and forced everyone to choke from the eye-watering concoction for several eternal minutes. Of course, the damned veterans sitting in with them were laughing between their coughs and annoyingly telling everyone else who wasn't too busy fighting to breathe about how much it reminds them of the good old days. That particular week was one of the most horrific experiences of Han's life, maybe even for several lifetimes. Yes, sir. The stern deputy gave a shrill whistle, which was heard and echoed first by the battalion captains, and then down to the lieutenants and sergeants. The formation spread out around several non-benders who held special staff slings with small clay pots nestled in them. The rushing tide of Earth Kingdom foot soldiers grew closer, but the regiment's leaders remained unfazed. Han gulped, the apprehension in his guts slightly overcome by a sense of pity for his enemies. Only once the human wave got a couple dozen or so yards away was the order given to let the projectiles loose. The slingers took a stance, nearby firebenders ignited the cloth stuffing, and then with a sharp snap, the clay jars were sent soaring through the air. Han watched as the first volley hit the front lines. Some of the earthenware broke against unlucky levies, setting them ablaze. Others crashed against the ground, spilling their hellish contents harmlessly. In any case, burning fuel began spewing a thick, foul smoke that broke the Earth Kingdom's advance. The war cries turned into panicked coughing, and confusion replaced battle resolve. Han saw men stumble over each other to crawl out of the growing smoke. Many of the conscripts dropped their weapons as they keeled over to puke or run for clean air. Then the second volley flew over the heads of the front lines, and the dreadful smoke erupted deeper in the enemy's ranks. As the faint tang of burning shit wafted back to the lines, Han felt a pang of sympathy for the enemy. Colonel Xing gave a sigh before he nodded. Spears. Controlled burn. With the order given, the spearmen began advancing in half-loose formation, a precaution in case of sudden earthbender attacks. The firebenders followed along, still focused on keeping the skies clear, with a few staff slingers walking with them, still lobbing naphtha into the enemy. Han's view of the front line was soon obscured by the armored backs of his comrades, but he saw the regiment's line tighten once they closed with the enemy, and the screams of the dying followed soon after. It was more of a slaughter or culling than combat. Han watched his comrades' slow and methodical advance, stepping over the dead and the dying of the Earth Kingdom troops. He could hear choked pleas. The faster they break, the less of these peasants need to die. The faster we get this over with. The colonel grumbled to no one in particular. Make a scene, he ordered, and his lieutenant relayed the order. Make them scream. Immediately, those spearmen in the back lines began squatting over bodies while drawing their short swords. The veterans, of course, acted far faster than the fresh recruits. Han flinched, seeing them put into practice the theory of desecrating a body to shock the enemy. Heads and limbs were lopped off the corpses, and then flung over to the enemy lines. A few staff slingers helped spread the terror further by throwing the heads deep into enemy lines. The result was a noticeable ripple in the mass of levies. Then Han spied the edges slowly breaking away, the first fleeing enemies abandoning the field. It was a slow thing at first, but in a span of a few minutes the trickle of fleeing infantry turned into a stream, and then a tide. By 10 minutes since the front lines clashed, the huge Earth Kingdom mob of levies had broken down into a disordered rout. The few stubborn clusters of resistance were promptly surrounded and crushed. The battalions reformed rather than give chase to the fleeing foe. Naphtha pots stopped flying, but body parts were still thrown to remind the fleeing soldiers to keep running. Despite the overwhelming first victory, the Earth Kingdom army looming before them still outnumbered the regiment significantly. More movement was spotted, and this time the rain of arrows and boulders finally petered out as the core soldiers and earthbenders began advancing with the second wave of levies. He saw several personal banners among the formations. Despite the spike in confidence, Han gulped, but then he heard the grin in the colonel's voice. Ah, finally. Hyung, everything's in order. The regiment's quartermaster standing just behind the platform gave a thumbs up and an unsettlingly cheery smile. Everything's hammered down and ready, Colonel. Colonel Xing gave a curt nod, though Corporal Han of Farada village, Farada Han too, since he was the second Han from the village. He would have been the first if he hadn't lost that damned race. Could tell he was smiling underneath his helmet. Good. They're moving on to being a bit more serious with us. Skies are clear, so have someone bring the princess over, please. Will do, Colonel, as the quartermaster volunteered a nearby helper. Han returned his attention to the next phase of the battle. Even from his position from behind the platform, he could see more crates of naphtha clay jars being brought up for the staff slingers, while the firebenders adopted a ready stance. Han saw lieutenants and captains running up and down the spear line, instructing soldiers to move the bodies around them so that they weren't piled on top of each other. They can't afford to throw any more rocks because it messes with the immediate terrain, Colonel Xing commented, as if someone was asking. He sounded far less uptight than back in the capital. Each boulder is a hole carved in the ground around them. They can't afford having any of those in the way of their advance. Sure enough, as the enemy drew closer, the corporal saw that their previous position was pockmarked with pits. If they try to patch it up, with so many people marching over it, there's a chance someone might fall in. Again, something they can't afford. You sound like you have things figured out, another young voice, one that scared Han even more, arrived on the scene. The soldiers on and around the platform bowed, save for Colonel Xing and Lieutenant Koshi. The latter gave a respectful nod, while the colonel inclined his head a little in acknowledgement. Princess AZULA, we are grateful for your presence. Han backed away to make way for Princess AZULA, noting how she paused to sniff the air. What is that smell? She asked with a scowl, almost drowned out by the footsteps of the colonels and her own bodyguards forming up to form a protective cage. The colonel's reply was surprisingly cheery. Powdered Komodo rhino and dragon moose dung, mixed with animal fat, tar, and a few other ingredients. Besides burning stubbornly, it has the added benefit of being a choking hazard. I can imagine, the princess simply said before she laid her eyes on the recent battlefield. Han thought it improper for a girl her age to witness such brutality. But Princess AZULA didn't offer much reaction, other than a clipped nod of her head. It's dirtier than I imagined. We are not dueling benders, Your Highness, Colonel Shing casually stated, and Han was not alone in sharply drawing in his breath. His sergeant in front of him shuffled back a step. This is what any battlefield would look like. Except that we've been lucky so far to not have any of ours join the bodies on the ground yet. What are those bodies missing parts? The colonel gave a nonplussed shrug. To inflict morale damage. I see. Some whistles drew everyone's attention, and Colonel Shing seemed satisfied. Han saw the second wave coming closer to nap the range. The non-bender infantry had shields warily up, while earthbenders in the front line seemed ready to summon a wall of earth at a moment's notice. The enemy's moving into range, he said in the same lecturing tone as before, probably for the princess' benefit this time. Usually they should still hold the advantage if our numbers were even. Their earth walls are resilient against our firebenders. A nod was all that was given, and Lieutenant Colonel Mosey relayed the order. Pinning. Almost as one, the spear line loosened, just enough for some firebenders to fill in the gaps, while another rank of firebenders stood behind the lines. The Earth Kingdom troops reacted to the shift by loosing some arrows and rocks, but as before, nothing got close enough to cause any real harm. When the enemies got within slinging range, the captains hurled fat bolts of flame towards the enemy. The rest of the firebenders followed suit, unleashing a fiery volley in turns to create a relentless stream of fire. The earthbenders reacted in time, and their walls came up as Han, and no doubt the colonel, expected them to. He heard the shouts of worry as dirt exploded from the intense flames. Almost immediately the damaged barriers were repaired as more earthbenders took up the defense. Some flames arced over the wall and the head of the frontmost ranks, causing the earthen barricade to rise a bit higher. Han also noted how it also caused the Earth Kingdom spear tips and banners peeking over the barrier to clump up closer, towards the safety of the walls which now grew thicker. As the withering barrage continued, the regiment's spearmen began to advance a few steps, pausing to allow the firebenders and Naphtha slingers to slowly catch up. Naphtha was eventually hurled, most making it over the Earth Kingdom walls where they caused sections of earth-bended dirt to crumble under the punishing offensive, and taking out dozens of soldiers hiding behind them. This time, though, most of the noxious smoke was quickly snuffed out. Han could imagine an earthbender burying the burning stuff with a stomp of his foot. A second volley was loosed, more ineffective than the first, and then the slingers switched back to spears to join the battle line. Soon, the Earth Kingdom advance stopped completely. It seemed like they were content to let the firebenders exhaust themselves against their walls. Han could see it making perfect sense, given that the regiment was outnumbered to start with. The Earth Kingdom had little to lose in waiting the attack out by reinforcing their barricade. Unfortunately, Han also knew his unit's purpose. And we've secured us a stalemate, Colonel Shing said rather eagerly. The princess didn't look or sound too impressed. Isn't this the part where you fall back and reveal flanking elements? Not enough time, the colonel replied with a shake of his head. Also, I wanted to try some things on a larger scale, he added by patting the metal tube beside him. Up close, Han could see that the walls of the tube were rather thick for its size. What things? In a moment, Your Highness. Somehow the polite and respectful words sounded anything but in Han's ears. If you'll note, the enemy army, though larger than ours, is happy to stay on the defensive instead of trying to encircle us. Princess AZULA folded her arms. It's a valid tactic. Having more earthbenders in a region means they'll spend less effort keeping their walls intact and far enough from the spearmen to get close and attempt a breach. Better than thinning themselves out trying to encircle us and risk a sudden breakthrough by our forces. Or push the walls forwards and play into any hidden traps you might have. True, but with their walls now so thick, it also means that they can't really see us. So you need the enemy to be stationary and blind. Colonel Shing nodded, glancing out at the relentless stream of fire blasting against the earthen line. One thing to note about earthbenders, Your Highness. They make good walls in a pinch, but those walls often don't come with ceilings. Then the colonel laconically turned his attention to Han and his equally silent and out-of-place sergeant. Hans. A shiver of anticipation ran up the corporal's spine. Get the Flammenwerfers. Yes, sir. Both Hans shouted before they rushed down the platform to join their unit standing by refitted carts. Sergeant Hans snapped off orders, and the 11th Regiment's Han unit finally took to the field. 15 armored carts were pushed at a fast and steady pace into battle by 2 heavily armored Hans each, at least one of which was a firebender. On top of the cart, metal plates shielded the large metal box that kept the fuel and the 4 pipes sticking out from it. Only the horizontal cylinder attached to the pipes, with its long perpendicular handle on one end and a leather-covered intestine hose on the other, stuck out from the shielding. A third Han sat at the head of the cart, just as heavily armored as his comrades. The third Han was always a non-bender. In his hands was a device with a thinner pipe that was attached to the hose. As team leader, Corporal Ferrata Han II was not riding on the cart. He'd have to worry about receiving and carrying out orders to be distracted by that position. A shame, really, but he understood the necessity of it. The Flammenwerfers rolled towards the front lines unimpeded, slowed down a little by the corpses in the way. Spearmen and firebenders made way for them, but all the drilling in the training yard had ensured that the shifting formation did not weaken the barrage. On Sergeant Araka Han's orders, the cart stopped. The Han pushers clambered up the back of the cart, both pairs of hands reaching for the handle while the Han riders stood up and aimed their thin pipes in the air above the Earth Kingdom's walls. Corporal Han and his fellow pushers began to pull and then push at the handle, working the double piston mechanism at a steady rate that quickly fed fuel through the hose. Thick, black streams shot out the thin pipes, and a flick of fire bending ignited the flammable liquid as it flew over the earthen barrier and rained down on the enemy soldiers. Packed so tightly together, the initial streams of fire sent scores of Earth Kingdom soldiers screaming. The choir was horrific, almost causing Han to stumble in his movements. The relentless firebenders' barrage quickly crumbled parts of the wall as the earthbenders maintaining it caught fire from the flailing of their ignited comrades. Those Hans close enough directed their streams of fire into those gaps, further increasing the torturous cacophony. As panic and confusion spread through the Earth Kingdom lines, the sergeant bellowed another order. Han left the pumping to his colleague while he got back down to the ground and slowly pushed the cart forwards. The riders continued spraying liquid fire, while spearmen and firebenders followed just behind them. Ferrata Han could see that the balance was tipping sharply in his regiment's favor, but the song of victory was nowhere close to heartening as he had imagined. AZULA had to consciously force herself to keep her jaws shut as she stared at the carnage, ignoring the sound of one of her guards being sick. She whirled to face Xing. Wah! When did you come up with this? Why haven't I seen this? Xing shrugged as he answered. I trained the unit when Your Highness and the Prince were not around. We used mock-ups and buckets of water back then, though. At the Princess Glare, he added. I wanted to keep it under wraps until the time was right. Like now? She asked archly. Infuriatingly, the boy just casually nodded. I rather have this be credited under your name, Princess, rather than have our many hidden observers present the idea as their own to the War Ministry. That made some sense. She gave a heavy sigh and looked to the battlefield, where the carts, the flammen thingies, had stopped spewing flames, and the infantry were now assaulting the broken center. Kai's and Ren's battalions slowly seeped into the breach, while the others kept their torrent of fire to keep the Earth Kingdom line from fully consolidating. Since the flames are raining from behind them, and being so packed as they are, it'd be tricky for the earthbenders to raise effective walls to contain the spread of fire without fracturing their formation. AZULA expected some sort of smugness from Xing, but he only sounded sad, regretful, and true enough, the princess saw more walls being raised, but these cut off the several ranks of Earth Kingdom soldiers from the rest of the army. The soldiers of the 11th advanced on these trapped men, and for some reason a small voice in AZULA's head said she was glad that she wasn't close enough to make out the details. The flame carts were redeployed to other areas, creating new breaches in the confused lines for other battalions to exploit. Very soon, a second, much taller bulwark of earth rose up, cutting off almost a third of the Earth Kingdom's army and leaving them to the mercies of the 11th Regiment. Xing's voice was cold and distant as he elaborated on what was transpiring. So long as the troops keep the enemy stuck to the walls, the rest of the Earth Kingdom will not be able to shoot boulders from it. even if the commanders are callous enough to not bother with things like friendly fire. Robs too much of the killing force, and anything significant enough to pierce or crush more than one soldier would significantly compromise the durability of their wall. And since they can't see, it'd be a risk to blindly send earth spikes shooting up the ground. Watching in silence, the princess took in what details she could. Spears pinned screaming men against the earth wall. Flames burst out as firebenders engaged the enemy with elbows and knees and short blades. Earthbenders were skewered with spears or dragged down by daggers. Among the agonized screaming and the stench of fire and shit and death, AZULA tried to muster an honest, triumphant grin. She tried very hard. The small voice in her head was louder now, almost pathetic in its utter gratitude that the carnage was far enough away. What now? She ended up asking instead, glancing at Xing, who was silently watching her. The colonel walked towards the metal tube and patted it firmly. Now we break more walls. He turned to the back of the platform and called for the quartermaster. Hyung, 1 crate, please. Full. Yeah, just in case. A crew of 4 men struggled as they carried up said crate and dropped it with a thud that slightly reverberated through the wooden floor. Without its cover, AZULA could see it contained iron balls, each only a little smaller than her head. As one of the camp followers carried a ball over to the end of the tube facing away from the enemy, the others moved to the front end, dragging along short wooden beams with them. After the iron ball was inserted snugly into it, Xing removed his helmet and sat at the back end of the tube with his legs splayed out rather awkwardly. I'm really glad we got Yama and the earthbenders to reinforce this platform, he muttered with dry humor as he looked at the wooden floor around him. Quartermaster Hyung cackled softly. I still say we could have made do with sturdy construction. Xing didn't answer, instead looking down the tube and then giving out orders to the men with the wooden beams. Raise it by 4. 2 men grunted as they grabbed the end of the tube and lifted it up, while the third quickly shoved 4 beams under its flattened out part, one over the other. Xing squinted for a moment before asking them to add 2 more beams. He finally gave a satisfied nod, and the men scampered off. Just to be safe, everyone please stand behind me. Oh, cover your ears and keep your mouths at least a little open. After relaying that, Xing took some wads of cloth and stuffed them in his ears. AZULA joined bodyguards, the grinning quartermaster and camp followers at the back of the platform, pointedly ignoring how ridiculous she must look following his instructions. She carefully observed Xing as he pressed the base of his palms together and then placed his hands at the mouth of the tube, letting the iron ball rest in his outstretched hand. The colonel then seemed to focus himself for a second, and AZULA could feel the air around her growing noticeably chilly. Hobbitson, Xing yelled, and a deafening roar of white flame erupted from his hands and out the tube. The tube itself jumped a few inches as the whole platform rattled, kicking up a cloud of dust and dirt. The air turned solid and punched the breath out of AZULA's lungs. She stumbled backwards, but Lieutenant Koshi caught her. Before the surprise could settle, an explosion sounded off in the Earth Kingdom's line, and snapping her head to the source, AZULA saw a small breach, along with a trail of mangled bodies and broken banners in its wake. Her royal bodyguards were clearly shocked, but the veterans of the 11th stood unfazed. Hyung was cackling a bit too eagerly, though. You're right, Colonel Sir. This is much better than using logs. Xing didn't comment, simply shuffling aside and gesturing for someone to grab another iron ball from the crate and fitting it into the smoking tube. He got back into position, shifting the base of the tube a little. Firing was all the warning AZULA got, and she got up her hands to hear ears in time as another deafening explosion sent the iron ball flying impossibly fast into the Earth Kingdom's barrier, blasting another hole in it. A couple of flaming carts took advantage of the collapsed section and poured fire into it, while the firebenders were already blasting their way into the first breach. AZULA stared wide-eyed at the colonel as he launched more iron balls into the enemy. Each time, he shifted the tube just a little, or got the men in heavy gloves to add or remove wooden beams on the other end. Xing's display of power here was far beyond what he'd demonstrated when he sparred with her. More amazingly, she also noted how the destructive rounds were so confidently sent without any fear about hitting his own troops. The princess watched raptly as the metal tube was fired 7 times in total. In the end, it was starting to glow a dull red. Xing stood up, stretching his limbs a little. He glanced out at the crumbling Earth Kingdom lines, and then offered AZULA a wry grin. That's phase 2 done. What had been a confident march on a paltry Fire Nation force had turned into a nightmare. Despite the impressive hail of stones into the enemy position, the first wave of peasant levies broke ranks and fled after some smoke wafted over them. That had initially puzzled Borgu, but then the fading fog drifted towards his position, and his eyes and nose itched badly from the stink. He couldn't imagine fighting in such conditions. No wonder the peasants fell before the Fire Nation soldiers. Luckily, the Earthbenders had ensured that such a foul fate would not befall the second wave, as the offensive clay pots and their contents were quickly buried as they broke onto the ground. Borgu caught a few seconds of choking, brain-numbing stench, but thankfully he could recover behind the safety of the earth-bended wall. He hadn't actually sought cover willingly. It was just that the human tide of thousands of soldiers around him naturally flowed towards cover, to avoid any stray fire that flew too high above the walls. The stench of hundreds of armored men around him was almost suffocating, but it was a far more tolerable one compared to the acrid smoke. He couldn't even see much beyond the bodies around him, other than more comrades pressed tightly against each other along the length of the wall. Trying to push onwards seemed futile, considering how the earthbenders were gritting their teeth as they constantly reinforced the barrier. They only looked annoyed, so Borgu felt a flash of confidence then, knowing that this sort of stalemate had always resulted in a victory for the patient earthbenders of Qinbao. Until now, at least. Borgu had been lucky enough when a strand of fire seemed to appear over the walls, and then fall down onto dozens of men less than a yard away from him. Their drawn-out, anguished screams sent chills down Borgu's spine, and only when he turned his neck did he realize that the screams were not echoing. More of the same strands of fire spilling over the walls at other places, inflicting the same torturous death on others. The human tide heaved then, almost crushing in its force. Many like Borgu twisted and screamed for everyone to fall back as they struggled for enough space to free their arms. Others were simply screaming in terror as their immolated colleagues spread the flames to them. Get it off. Get it off. Get it. Stop. Stop pushing me. Damn yoai. Help. Help. Only his own selfish desire to survive shut off the tormented wailing around him as more people fell to the liquid fire that rained all about him. Borgu let go of his spear and used both hands on his shields to push back against the roiling mass of soldiers. Burnt meat and hair and wood filled his nostrils, and it lent him strength to push his way out of the crowd. Go back! Go back! He and some others roared desperately through the sounds of burning men. A grinding sound made Borgu turn around, and through the throng of dozens, he almost froze in terror as a small part of the wall crumbled, and a hail of fire filled the space. Dozens of men managed aborted screams before they were consumed by it, or maybe scores or even hundreds. Borgu wasn't keeping count. He quickly returned to the task of trying to escape the stormy waves of humanity. The flow jarringly shifted every time more of the fire splashed down above everyone's heads, as soldiers tried to flee from their burning comrades, who flailed about in panic. A man on fire was flung over the masses as an earthbender decided he didn't want to be burnt, trailing dripping fire as he landed into another group of unlucky souls. It didn't help the bender much, as another stream spilled over the wall's edge and drenched the man. The man's screams and struggles were mercifully short. A ripple of movement pushed Borgu back towards the front lines, back towards the fire. Then he saw another wall rise in the distance, one that now seemed to prevent him from reaching safety. It didn't matter, he thought. He'll climb it. Borgu could no longer hear himself. Everything was drowned out in the screams of hundreds of dying men. He lost sense of his surroundings. The only thing running through his mind was the need to break free from this press of bodies. His hands felt empty. He must have dropped his shield somehow. There was a flash of light to his left, so Borgu immediately pushed in the opposite direction. His foot stumbled on something, almost tripping him. Borgu barely glanced down, and didn't care that the obstacle below him looked like a helmet attached to something. The added height as he stepped on it was almost refreshing for his limbs while it lasted. Another streak of fire soared above his head, so Borgu tried to force himself out of the way from the falling, incendiary rain. The screams became white noise to him by now. He didn't care about the smell of burnt meat anymore. The lungfuls of tainted air was more important. He needed to keep breathing. He needed to get out of here. Borgu's struggles ended abruptly when an explosion boomed from behind him. He didn't have the time to react as a red-hot iron ball tore through rock and men, bouncing off the ground to plow through his left chest. "Stay close," Captain Rin shouted as she dove into the ranks of panicked Earth Kingdom soldiers. Flames burst from her limbs as she struck men with her fists, elbows, knees, and feet, and fought her way towards pockets of heavy fighting. Her armor turned aside fear-fueled strikes of spears and blades, and her troops behind and beside her secured her blind spots. An earthbender struggled to form a stance in the tight confines, being nudged from his fleeing comrades. Rin quickly lunged at him, a flame already building in the palm of her hand as she lashed out with an open palm strike. The blow and the fiery explosion that followed snapped the earthbender's charred head back, and Rin was already moving before he dropped dead to the ground. She twisted away from a desperate lunge of a spear and held onto the weapon to allow a fellow trooper an easy strike through the offender's face. Relieving the dying man of his spear, Rin promptly swung it into the back of another enemy soldier who was winning a bout against a fellow trooper. The blow didn't penetrate armor, but knocked the man off balance, creating enough of an opening for a dagger to slip through and carve out his neck. The extremely close quarters made throwing fire nearly impossible, so Rin carved a path of fire and blood when she heard the desperate orders of an Earth Kingdom commander. It was merely a sergeant, trying to get his squad to maintain formation amidst the panic around them. Credit to him, his men were holding up well, pushing aside their panicking comrades while they expertly fended off Fire Nation spears. Ren swung her hands together, flinging a short wave of fire that knocked 3 warriors back. Lieutenant Sung surged past her, delivering a flying knee into another soldier, the flames that trailed after him cooking the victim in his armor. Ren dove for the sergeant as he tried to stab her lieutenant's exposed back, grabbing the brave fool's head from behind. The blast of fire that followed was weak, but more than enough to sear through leather and cloth and stun the sergeant. A quick draw of her dagger saw his throat slit for a mercifully quick end. A squad of her battalion's spearmen came up, quickly dispatching the rest of the broken squad. Pausing to note her surroundings, Ren then turned to her lieutenant, whose helmet and armor was as dirty with soot and dirt as her own. "We're making good progress." Sung gave a curt nod, his body still rising and falling as he caught his breath. "Yes, ma'am. There's still a lot more pouring out from the second wall, though. We'll beat them," she replied confidently. "Stick close to them. Deny their earthbenders the room they need." "Yes, ma'am." Rin gave a final nod, and then risked a quick glance back to see her battalion right behind her, with Kai's 1st Battalion and Weikong's 3rd Battalion on either side making good progress as well. A stream of men in Earth Kingdom armor were fleeing in practically all directions, largely ignored by the regiment. Those that ran into the advancing back line and Flammenwerfers would be told to get on their hands and knees to surrender. Those that fled in other directions were ignored. They were just enlisted men and conscripts. They could be allowed their freedom so long as they didn't get in the way. The captain filled her lungs with another breath of dirty air before bellowing to get her troops' attention. "All right, boys and girls, reform their dash," she pointed at a breach in the second wall, "and kill anything that stops you from doing that." Her men and women gave a roar of affirmation, and Rin picked another gaggle of Earth Kingdom soldiers conveniently in her way and charged them. Lieutenant Koshi frowned as he watched the colonel pass him the last of his armor. "You are a colonel now," Mosey was saying, trying to reason with the boy. "You should not be out there right now." Now down to just his padded shirt and trousers, Xing turned to him. "The enemy's reorganizing better than we thought, Mosey. Once they calm down enough to realize they can just back up to make the distance they need from us, we'll lose the advantage. And the battle," the lieutenant colonel sighed heavily. "We can always keep the pressure up with conventional doctrine. We're still outnumbered," Xing pointed out with a shake of his head. "And if we don't break them now, the fleeing elements might reform. Our advantage has a short life to be exploited. Mosey, you know this." Unfortunately, even Koshi knew that the colonel was right. Mosey relented with a heavy sigh. "I still don't like it." "Look on the bright side," Xing said with a smirk. "You might make colonel." "Xing." Princess AZULA's interruption reminded Koshi of her presence, and she was frowning with heavy disapproval. "What are you doing?" There was no hesitation from him. "Finishing this fight, Your Highness." "It'll be fine, don't worry." "What dash?" Xing ignored her and turned to Koshi, giving his battle-hungry grin. "See you in a bit, Koshi." The bodyguard lieutenant could only sigh, not bothering to try dissuading the colonel. "We'll be quick, sir." With the princess still demanding him to stop, Xing confidently leapt from the edge of the platform, just as Koshi and Mozi quickly formed a fire shield between them and Xing. A flash of blinding flames then burst out from the boy's feet and back, the blast deflected by the shield and sending Xing hurtling across the field. No more than a couple of seconds later, there was a huge detonation of white fire in the middle of an Earth Kingdom formation, the one with the most banners around it. Koshi quickly led his team of bodyguards to the front, quietly grateful that he was glad he wasn't saddled with Mozi's new task of reassuring and placating the princess. "Ah, Your Highness, you see." Bursts of fire from their feet propelled the bodyguards towards the front lines in seconds. But in Koshi's mind it was still seconds too long. His charge was deep in the enemy ranks, and while Xing could no doubt cripple most of the Earth Kingdom's command, he was still just one boy surrounded by soldiers who might be hardened enough to surround and overwhelm him. The memory of a bloodied Xing fighting in the rear guard at Tai Plains flashed through Koshi's head, and his jaws tightened in response. "Don't waste time punching through them," he ordered with grim determination. "Our priority is the colonel." With that, the lieutenant leapt up once he reached the mass of bodies, and in a repeat of the defense of Jiacheng, skipped across the heads of the enemy to get to his destination. It helped the regiment that each step was followed by a burst of fire that seared exposed heads or stunned protected ones as it pushed him onwards. Some Earth Kingdom soldiers had the presence of mind to stab at the bodyguards with spears and blades, and even earth-bended spikes. They were paid little mind. If anything, Koshi and his unit seized the spears and used them to speed up, stabbing the weapons into unsuspecting victims and using the momentum to pole vault across the mass of bodies. It was easy finding Xing. Koshi only needed to keep his eyes on the massive fading column of smoke and the bursts of flame erupting from within. The head bodyguard caught sight of his ward moments later. Amidst the charred bodies and body parts, Xing was darting around the shallow crater that was his detonation site. He was engaged with Earth Kingdom officers and elite guards in varying stages of burning. Some of the men had discarded the scraps of their armor and fought in singed gambeson. Others were stubbornly fighting on despite their badly burnt state. Xing danced amongst them, keeping close to his victims to prevent the earthbenders from effectively pinning him. As Koshi watched, the boy's hands managed to weave through the swings of a badly wounded soldier, reaching for the man's face. The soldier tried to reel back, but the burst of white flame burnt through his neck, sending the head falling off like an overripe fruit. The colonel immediately grabbed the headless body and pulled it down, jumping on top of it to avoid the wave of earth spikes from two earthbenders. Then he pounced onto his next victim, this time using a sweeping midair kick. The poor fool replied by swinging his blade in an attempt to cut the attacking limb off. Xing simply let off the explosion charged in his leg just before impact, which literally blew the man apart. Then the boy lunged with clawed hands at the next victim. Koshi snapped out of his distracted state and remembered his duty. The outer edges of the enemy were now recovering from the explosion and were slowly closing in on them. "Protect the colonel," he shouted and charged into the fray. He punched a man who was turning to him, the flames bursting against exposed flesh to instantly kill. Koshi drew his short sword and parried an overcommit lunge, then without a second thought channeled flames into the tip of his blade before plunging it into the exposed armpit of his attacker. A twist and a yank, and he then tossed his blade into the face of another Earth Kingdom soldier, using the distraction to deliver a swift uppercut. A quick burst of chi saw the man's head burst apart in bone and gore. Buofeng took a shallow cut across his armor, just as he landed a flaming fist each into a soldier that all but disintegrated their chests and sent them flying like ragdolls. Shansu sent a wide kick around him, the flaming wave that followed it keeping the colonel's back clear and sending several men screaming as they tried to put out the flames. Quan expertly closed in on an earthbender and promptly immolated his opponent, then tossed the still flailing man into a group of soldiers. The bodyguards were brutally murdering anyone that they could reach, and slowly but surely the noose of spears around them loosened and began backing away. A few earthbenders stomped their feet, and immediately several bodyguards countered the ripples in the ground by literally blowing holes in front of them. Small boulders were drawn up and flung, and Koshi contemptuously batted each aside with some fire-bending. "Colonel," he wanted to warn his charge, but Xing seemed to get the wrong idea because the boy was grinning savagely. "We're surrounded, Koshi," he yelled aloud with a sinister cackle. "Let's show them why that's a bad idea." With that, Xing gave a roar and vented his violence on the hapless souls who stood in front of him. His whole body blazed as he swung his fists, each strike burning through metal and leather and flesh before it fully passed them. Men screamed and gurgled in horrific agony as the flames were so intense that those too close caught fire as well. Spear shafts turned to cinder, metal bucklers folded like warmed wax. Even Koshi and his men had to be mindful about getting too close. The last time Xing tried this, Kai and his fellows had barely left just in time for only their armor to turn to ash. All they could do right now was ensure that the colonel's back was clear, and to look out for any large boulders being sent his way, and keep up the callous slaughter. With the crowd backing away, Xing stomped into a wide stance, and the flames surrounding his body died out instantly, leaving a thin sheen of frost on the boy's now naked body. Koshi and his team had just enough time to be sure they were out of the boy's line of fire as he opened his mouth. What came out was not a mere tongue of flame, but a condensed, nearly straight line of fire. A beam of fire so hot, it hurt to even look at it directly. Colonel Li Dai had called it the Dragon's Wrath. Xing, though, preferred atomic breath. Whatever that meant. The Earth Kingdom soldiers who were in the way of said beam, and their comrades a dozen ranks behind them, didn't have the chance to scream as the white fire instantly turned flesh and bone into ash. Xing turned his head, and the beam scythed through dozens more men, leaving in its wake charred clumps and slagged metal dropping onto the ground. That broke the ring of soldiers around them, and the terror that was sowed into the ranks finally blossomed into full maturity. Conscripts and enlisted men alike dropped their weapons and simply fled, their commanders shamelessly joining them. Those that stumbled or fell were trampled. Those that had the presence of mind fell to their knees begging to surrender. It was easy enough to avoid the fleeing men around them. Koshi only needed to firebend a noticeable gout of fire, and the oncoming rush of panicking men moved in the opposite direction. With occasional bursts of flames, the bodyguards formed a protective circle around Xing, and Koshi was there just in time to catch the colonel as he collapsed into a shivering heap. "Aye, it did the teacher KK," the boy asked through chattering teeth. Even with gloves on, Koshi could tell that his body was cold. Not as dangerously cold as that first time, but still something to worry over. Koshi looked around at the chaos around him, and then offered a single nod. "Yes, sir." Xing let out a frosted breath. "Ha! T told you it to do the J job." Despite his caution, nothing could have prepared General Tanhua for the one-sided carnage. The choking gas of the enemy was a mild surprise and easily dealt with once the grizzled general saw it in action. But their firebenders were a much greater threat. To be outnumbered and yet still put up a firestorm that warranted the attention of nearly every earthbender in the front was impressive, concerningly impressive. The messengers brought back reports that the front line was only just keeping up the shield wall. Only just. There were at least 3 times more earthbenders keeping the wall up than firebenders trying to blast it down. If that wasn't enough, a new form of fire literally splashed over the walls, and the chaos it brought could be judged by the screams that wafted towards the back lines. Tanhua instantly realized the danger this exotic flame brought, but it would cost a lot of lives to pull back and reorganize. At least it knocked the youthful arrogance out of Wenli. His protege wore a grim, sober mask as he took in the unfolding chaos. When Tanhua gave the hard order to abandon the front ranks and erect a second wall, the younger general only hesitated for a moment before agreeing with it. But then the damned explosions started, and projectiles flew through earth and men that effectively broke the second barrier and signaled the end of the engagement. Tanhua saw the Fire Nation force pour through the breaches, and saw how they quickly pushed back the force that was supposed to overwhelm them with sheer ferocity. Even from a distance, even in the chaotic mess obscuring his one good eye, he saw them tear down the opposition. In less than a dozen seconds, Tanhua realized that these were not Fire Nation soldiers. They did not fight. They were murderers, butchers, executioners. They slaughtered their way through the Earth Kingdom army, even their firebenders preferring to wade into savage close quarters to spill blood and cut throats. The general saw why many in the south feared the Fire Nation's 11th Regiment. "We must pull back," he had wanted to say, and was prepared to argue with Wenli and the other commanders around him for it. But a bright flash in the back of the Fire Nation's lines caught his attention, and instincts honed from countless battles told Tanhua to stomp his foot and raise an earth wall. That saved him and Wenli from the deafening explosion that followed. but the force of the blast sent Tanwa flying into the ranks of confused soldiers around him. His armor protected him from the worst of it, but the breaking of bones told the general of the demise of the unfortunates who literally broke his fall. Charred remains of bodies fell onto him, half burying Tanwa. The living troops around him were either too distracted by the explosion or hadn't thought he was alive to be recovered. Tanwa wanted to yell at them to free him, but then he saw what they saw. The young dragon stood in the midst of a blackened crater, practically naked save for some scraps of burnt clothing. Unbridled malice radiated from the boy, bringing with it a promise of death. "I am open to accepting your surrender now, gentlemen." Colonel Sai had gotten back to his feet and answered with a defiant roar and a hail of stone spikes. The boy left wisps of smoke as he evaded all of them, and in the same steps closed the distance to press a small hand against the colonel's half-melted armor. An explosion of white flame poured Sai out and incinerated several troops behind him, and the noble colonel fell dead with a smoldering hole in his chest. The young dragon looked around him with a cold, violent grin. "Let the record show that my offer was refused. I now only offer all of you the mercy of a quick death." Some lieutenants at the edges of the crater took the words as a challenge and charged, swords and stones leading the way. The Fire Nation colonel ducked and weaved between them, and an elbow strike blew apart one officer at the waist, while a palm strike underneath the chin erupted into a flame that devoured the front half of the victim's head. The boy began to dart about with all the lethal agility of a sand shark. Wounded colonels and captains who were just rising were immolated with kicks that rendered them to ashen heaps. Valiant bodyguards were torn into smoldering pieces as white fire bloomed from each strike of the young dragon. Tanwa saw none of the flowing aggressiveness of a firebender. The boy's movements were clipped and coldly precise, but his attacks were a storm of punches and elbows and kicks, just as explosive as his flames were. The general heard some of the men around him mustering some courage, the sergeants and captains urging their men to overwhelm the boy, but his own troops entered the fray. The savagery that followed would have been impressive, if not for the boy to suddenly open his mouth and live up to his namesake. Tanwa squirmed back into the corpses as the condensed beam of fire swung right above his head. Even with his eyes closed, its light stabbed into the back of his eyes, and if not for the corpses blocking him, the heat of the passing attack might have been the end of him. He wasn't surprised when he heard his army routing. He would have likely ran too, if not for his current state. With the rush of that spectacle over, Tanwa finally felt the effects from his fall seeping in. He bit back on the sharp pain in his legs and right arm, and struggled to worm his way out of his grave of burnt bodies. "Ah, General." Tanwa froze at the voice addressing him, and turned to see the young colonel, draped in a cloak, walking over towards him. An armored guard stood beside the boy, veiled face quietly regarding the surroundings for threats. "You look like you could use some help." He felt too tired to muster much, so the general simply sighed heavily. "Just get it over with," he said, locking a stare at the boy. Tanwa would not shy away from his end. He still had enough courage and defiance for that. "You're not going to surrender, then?" "Accept my men's surrender, but I will not shame myself with capture." The young dragon gave an annoyed sigh. "Do you have family, General?" Tanwa's stare turned blank, caught off guard by the question. "What dash? Do you have a family back home? Wife, children, grandchildren? You look old enough. You leave them out of this." The general managed to roar, finding a burst of anger to fuel him. His foe merely sighed again. "So, you won't shame yourself with capture, but you're fine with abandoning your family. Isn't that more shameful, General?" Despite the pain throbbing across his body, Tanwa stiffened at the sudden turn of questions. "You don't dash." The arrival of more Fire Nation soldiers interrupted the conversation, and Tanwa's heart sank as he saw a battered Wenli lead a gaggle of soot-covered survivors. Probably no more than 60 of them, their arms behind their back in surrender. They all stopped a few paces away, and one of the red-clad soldiers saluted the boy. "Colonel, we've started rounding up prisoners. There's a general in this group." The colonel turned to the new prisoners, and he was about to speak when Wenli dropped to the floor and shamelessly groveled for mercy. "Please spare me. I can pay you anything you want. I've got the money. I'm a brother of the Duke." Several other captains and colonels followed suit, dropping to their knees and begging for their lives. It shocked and hurt Tanwa to see his men, his student especially, so reduced to this. The young dragon regarded them dispassionately, but the postures of the Fire Nation soldiers present betrayed their disgust. The boy was turning to one of his soldiers when Tanwa saw the lips on Wenli's wailing face tugging upwards into a grin. Tanwa's blood ran cold. "Wenli! No!" he would have shouted, but it was too late. His protege's mask dropped, and his hands, once clasped together pleading for mercy, quickly slammed into the ground to send a ripple in the ground towards the boy. The young dragon twisted aside as a quartet of spikes as tall as he was shot up to impale him. Shouts of alarm rang out from the Fire Nation soldiers as the other groveling officers unveiled similar treachery, stomping feet or slamming palms to shred the ground with more spikes or tear open small chasms. It was an impressive display of an otherwise disgusting act, with some of the Fire Nation troops being speared through armor and limbs as they just barely failed to evade the ambush. Wenli and his conspirators quickly got up to follow up on their attack, but their enemy was far less unbalanced than they'd expected. The young dragon looked furious as he sent a swift kick at a charging lieutenant, the column of fire from it leaving a blackened lump of flesh and slag. The guards and soldiers around him burst into lethal motion, protecting their commander. Colonel Sunjio tried to send out a pillar of rock, but a firebender who had escaped the ambush and scathed dove at him, sending a flaming hand chop that broke and seared his neck. A captain got into the stance to begin hurling boulders, but spears plunged into his battered armor and lifted him entirely off the ground. Another found himself barely taking a running step towards the young dragon when several soldiers tackled him, their daggers quickly working to pry apart his limbs. "I want that general alive," he ordered coldly as he sidestepped a wave of rocks and reached for the offending earthbender with an open palm. The explosion that followed was such that the man's limbs were torn apart as his burnt body was flung away. Within a few dozen seconds of the ambush, Wenli and his men were brought down. The general himself was subdued by a roaring giant, who grabbed him from behind and lifted him bodily into the air. The last of the treacherous officers were swiftly incinerated or simply stabbed to death with daggers and spears. In exchange, maybe a dozen soldiers of the 11th were pinned by rocky spikes or thrown to the ground. Temporary wounds, all of them. Save for the chance of infection, they'd avoided the worst of the surprise attack and would at most need some time to recover. It was an abject failure. The boy surveyed the fresh corpses, and then with cold rage in his eyes turned to Wenli, who was still in the arms of the giant firebender, and then to the prisoners who didn't take part in the ambush and stood back in stunned surprise, and finally turned his gaze to Tanwa. The general drew in a breath and steeled his resolve, for the sake of his men. "I knew not of this ploy. I swear by the spirits that they acted alone." Tanwa shifted in his prison of corpses and tried to draw himself up as best as he could. "Punish me for their failure if you must. But please, I beg of you, accept the surrender of my men." The young dragon's fury suddenly flared and just as suddenly snuffed out. His shoulders slumped a little, and the boy finally broke his glare to shake his head bitterly. "We cannot trust this group," he muttered, and Tanwa felt a cold void in his guts open up as the Fire Nation soldiers surrounded their prisoners who had realized what was to come. Wenli started screaming and struggling in protest, for what little it was worth. Officers and common soldiers alike began to plead for their lives, dropping to their knees in genuine despair. "I didn't know about them, I swear. We didn't have anything to do with them. Mercy, please have mercy." The boy locked his gaze once more onto Tanwa, and then gave a slow nod. With spears corralling the prisoners into a tight group, the firebenders began hurling their flames into them. Tanwa closed his eyes and turned his head away, and shamefully thanked the spirits that the screams of his men were drowned out by the roar of a localized firestorm. Once the fire and the screaming died down, the colonel's next order further deepened Tanwa's anguish. "We will not accept the surrender of any earthbenders from this army." "Understood, sir." When the general dared to open his eyes again, he found the boy standing before Wenli, who was now slumped over and sobbing. "Know that neither me nor my men wanted that to happen. Know that it was your actions that forced our hand." Tanwa found himself freed from the press of corpses as several Fire Nation soldiers helped him up. He tried to struggle, but the flares of pain brought his attention to his unnaturally loose right arm and his likely broken legs. He was carried over and placed at a short distance from Wenli. The Fire Nation commander regarded him with a cold stare. "Tell me that you would have acted differently in my place, General. Tell me I am a monster for ordering what I did against a false surrender." Tanwa flinched away from the stare, and as he grit his teeth and growled helplessly, the general hated that he could not truthfully voice his protest. The protocol of surrender was one of the few rules of war that any side adhered to in the century-long war. If the roles were reversed, Tanwa knew he would have ordered every Fire Nation soldier, fleeing or surrendering, to be hunted down and buried alive. His silence was all the answer the boy needed, and he turned to the younger general. "Unfortunately, I need you alive. As you said, you are a brother of a duke after all. Let him down, Kai." Tanwa watched in silence, with spears hovering from his neck, as his protege was callously dropped, and the young dragon reached out to grab the general by the wrists. "You will send a message for me, General." For a second, Tanwa thought the boy was talking to Wenli, but then the colonel's attention was turned towards him. The cold pit in Tanwa's stomach made itself known once more. "You will be treated, and then released." Wenli screamed as light seeped from the boy's tightening hands, until finally they closed into fists, and Wenli's hands fell off from the stumps that were his wrists. "You will then take the Duke's brother back to Qinbao, and tell the Duke that the 11th Regiment is coming, and that we have had our fill with treachery." The young dragon gave a nod at his nearby guards. "Spread his legs out." They did as ordered, and the boy pressed a foot onto an ankle, brutally severing it with a burst of white flame. The other foot suffered the same fate shortly after. Wenli's screams filled the air, drawing the dispassionate attention of nearby Fire Nation soldiers. "Let the Duke and his people know, the next time we encounter a false surrender, all prisoners we take from then on will end up like his brother." The boy turned to a nearby soldier. "Send this general to Elder Kylan. As for the other one, just make sure his screams doesn't distract everyone." AZULA marched across the now quieted battlefield with an anger born out of confusion. The new weapons Xing had so casually displayed were competing with the colonel's display of firebending in her mind. Neither had been what she had expected at all, and the screams of burning men were kept from being etched into her mind only from the sight of explosions from the safety of the viewing platform. She'd heard of using firebending to add distance to leaps or sprints, but the burst of speed Xing had achieved was on another level entirely. And then the explosion that followed. The dome of white fire that appeared for the briefest moment was the most beautifully violent thing the princess had ever seen. And it also told AZULA how vast the chasm of power was between the boy and everyone else. As she passed the loitering flame carts watching over a line of soot-covered prisoners, AZULA saw a trooper running towards one of the soldiers standing by the carts. Curiosity made her pause and redirect her steps towards the messenger and the keenly interested crowd of soldiers around him. "Read to kill him," the messenger spoke hurriedly. The man he was directed to talk to, Sergeant Han, if she remembered the markings right, did not hide his surprise. They dare to." AZULA stepped in, needing to sate her curiosity. "What's going on, soldier?" The messenger snapped towards her and saluted formally, hiding his surprise rather well. "Your Highness, there was an attempt to assassinate the colonel through a false surrender." Her eyes widened. "False surrender? These Earth Kingdom weaklings were so pathetic to dare such a thing? They didn't even have the courage to fight to the last or wait for an opportunity to break out of imprisonment." Lieutenant Colonel Mosey and the bodyguards behind her were also similarly aghast at such blatant treachery. Some of the prisoners trotting past glanced at the group, but were thankfully too far to eavesdrop. As such, new orders are to take no Earthbender prisoner. Only Earthbenders? Surely Li Dai wasn't that soft? "We should just burn the whole lot of them," one of the Hans said, to the angry nods of the others. "You have your orders." Mosey stepped in with a stern voice. "The Earthbenders are easy enough to distinguish. Separate them from the rest for now. We'll remove them after." AZULA felt the man's cold stare sweep across the troops. "No mistakes, understood?" Another Han sputtered. "But what if their uniform is too damaged?" "Err on the side of caution," Mosey said without hesitation. "Put them in with the Earthbenders." They resumed walking, this time with a clearly concerned Mosey leading the way. AZULA's face was stuck in a frown as she tried to find the rationale in Xing's soft-handed order. In the end, she gave up and asked the lieutenant, "I don't get it. Why isn't the regiment purging all prisoners?" Mosey didn't slow as he turned his head over his shoulder to address her. "If I were to guess, Your Highness, Colonel Xing is probably going to use the obvious show of mercy for later." "If you were to guess?" AZULA repeated with a raised eyebrow. The man sighed. "This is the first time we've ever had to deal with something like this, Your Highness." "So what? Xing is just going to keep these non-bender prisoners and let them know how lucky they are that he's a nice guy. Mosey shook his head as he sidestepped a small pile of burnt men. AZULA had quickly learned to not acknowledge her environment, and was rather thankful for this topic to distract herself with for the time being. She focused her full attention to the lieutenant colonel's back and words, using that to tune out the stench. "No, Your Highness. Since practically all Earth Kingdom officers are earthbenders, there's no prisoners worth keeping." The princess had to consciously keep her feet from tripping over each other at the words. "But you have hundreds of non-bending prisoners headed towards our camp. They'll be released shortly after we've cleared the battlefield, Your Highness." Colonel Xing finds it far more effective to release enlisted soldiers, whether they be benders or otherwise. It taxes our resources far less, and we've found that the experience they bring back with them often spreads morale damage to the enemy. So, he's building a reputation for his regiment. That made some sense. But wouldn't the Earth Kingdom learn of the regiment's tactics? Despite the worry etched on his face, Mosey still managed a faint smirk. The rank and file, and even the junior officers rarely care to notice how they were defeated in the wider scale, Your Highness. They might tell of our new weapons, but we've found that knowledge itself is largely useless for the Earth Kingdom, as it often does not include how we actually use them, or what their weaknesses are. A group of soldiers were running towards them, and AZULA recognized Captain Kai at the lead, waving an arm at them. "Also, Your Highness," Mosey continued, "they also bring back the knowledge that they were released. That fact is rather surprisingly effective at getting the common soldiers to break when we encounter them in the future. If managed properly, we could lessen the burden of fighting just by encouraging the Earth Kingdom rank and file to drop their weapons or abandon the field." AZULA digested that last point in silence. Xing's lessons back then only dealt with maneuvers, commander decisions, and how various tactics were put to use. This was the first she'd heard of using freed prisoners as a tool. Come to think of it, the boy's lessons never included his flame carts or metal tube either. Her thoughts were interrupted as Kai approached in a light jog. "Mosey, oi, emolo, Your Highness." He skidded to a stop and immediately bowed and saluted. Despite the current air of trepidation, AZULA found herself smiling inwardly at the display of instant respect the people of the 11th gave her. "The Earth Kingdom resorted to foul play," the large man reported, to which Mosey nodded. "We heard from the runner. How did it happen?" Kai then provided his first-hand report of delivering the Earth Kingdom's general and his group of prisoners to Xing, and how the pathetic commander had tried to kill the colonel. Even the usually stoic Mosey was practically trembling with rage at the retelling. But then Kai told of how he captured the treacherous general, and how Xing had punished the man. The anger at the brainless general turned into wide-eyed admiration at Xing. Clearly, killing the weakling was not enough. Xing had sent a rather powerful message, and it was one that AZULA was sure her father would approve of once she got back home and told him about it. But still, so why are the non-bending prisoners being kept? She asked, still finding their existence questionable. "Your Highness, Xing wants people to know what happened here. We'll spread the news to the prisoners later, and have the other general verify it for them before sending him back. He seems genuinely ashamed enough for it. Then we'll let the non-benders go, and the Earth Kingdom can't say we were bad hosts." Not with the false surrender being general knowledge. The big softy grinned as he added, "And that kind of news wouldn't sit well in the Duke's court, or any others for that matter." That was something she hadn't considered, and seemed obvious now that AZULA thought about it. The Earth Kingdom was known to be a fractious realm, with Ba-Sing-se barely exerting any control over its many states. Court politics would no doubt be even more cutthroat than her father's own court, and the Fire Nation nobles were stupid enough to consign Xing's regiment to extinction. AZULA could easily imagine some ambitious noble using this event to at least disgrace the Duke of Qinbao. Vassals might even use the excuse of such treachery to secure guarantees for their future involvement with the Duke, be it military or otherwise. Regardless, they'd be less eager to cooperate in future engagements, not wanting to stain their own names with the great blot that the false surrender has given the Duke. The chaos was something she wished she could witness personally. "Where is Xing?" AZULA asked, and Kai nodded back to a gathering of soldiers. "He's back there. I suggest you wait for a bit, Princess. Xing's attack has, damaged his armor." "Damaged armor?" Unamused, AZULA ignored the captain's sputtered protests and started walking again. only for Mosey to cut in with a polite cough. What the captain meant, Your Highness, was that the colonel's form of attack had rendered him rather vulnerable. He was removing his armor earlier to ensure that his flames didn't destroy them. Then why the damaged armor excuse? The princess rolled her eyes and kept moving. So Xing has fire bending that is so powerful it could break his armor. Why did that? Oh, his clothes. AZULA slowed a little as the realization dawned on her. But seeing he was just beyond the group of soldiers, and not wanting to appear indecisive, she drew in a breath and powered on. She already took the trouble to walk all the way here. She would not waste her time doubling back now. She was definitely not being curious. Not at all. The troops who noticed her quickly signaled their comrades with light backhands, and they parted for AZULA in short order. At the center, the backs of Captains Run and Wakong were nodding along to something. They paused to notice the crowd around them, and after a quick glance over their shoulders to see AZULA, the captains promptly fully turned to face her and give her a sharp salute. I was told Xing is here, she immediately asked, noting how the captains were exchanging glances. Rin gave a grin to a confused Wakong and then nodded. Yes, Your Highness. He's right here. With that, the woman took a step aside, revealing a rather exposed Xing who was caught in the middle of reaching out to Rin. AZULA blinked several times as she saw practically all of the colonel. The cloak around him covered barely enough, and even then she could make out obscured movements within the shadows. Xing was quite well built, she noted. There were some faded scars on his lean frame, including one that ran diagonally right to left across his belly. For some reason, having the lower half of the scar and most of the boy's hips blocked by the cloak annoyed AZULA's senses. The princess clacked her jaws shut, realizing that her thoughts had been seriously derailed. Xing gave a soft cough before he bowed, letting the cloak cover more of him. Princess AZULA, why was she annoyed at the cloak? Right. Xing, quickly refocusing her thoughts. AZULA reined her composure behind the mask of royal aloofness. I came to congratulate you on your impressive victory, especially in dealing with the Earth Kingdom's treachery. She tried to keep her eyes locked onto his still bowing form. A small part of her wishing Xing would stand straight again. Thank you, Princess. I'll see you back in camp. I expect a full report about what transpired here. As you command, Your Highness. Awkwardness descended right after that, and AZULA turned away before the silence could drag on. It was the wrong thing to do, as she was treated to the view from the Earth Kingdom's perspective. AZULA froze as she was finally forced to register the amount of bodies littering the charred field. She saw a line of soldiers from 11th methodically moving up, prodding the corpses they came across with their spears. Occasionally, one would bend down to study something, and call out for other soldiers to come in and drag out a barely living Earth Kingdom warrior. The one AZULA saw being carried away had half his face melted, and a leg dangling uselessly like there was no bone in it. There was a pile of burnt things just a stone's throw from where she stood, with enough details on them for the princess to make out where melted armor and burnt cross ended, and where charred flesh began. Her keen mind unfortunately made out the details of a face amongst that pile, the lower jaw dangling loosely in an overly wide scream. The eyes and nose melted in, his helmet cracked and broken. AZULA found herself breathing heavily, her body feeling both light and sluggish at the same time as her senses took in all of the carnage before her. Unburnt corpses with gaping wounds where their faces were, severed and almost limbs, a burnt husk leaning against the spear skewering it. Before she knew it, AZULA turned away and bent over, her eyes watering and her throat burnt as she coughed, gagged, and finally emptied the contents of her stomach. She felt a hand patting her on the back, and another gently holding back her hair. Garbled noises were drowned out by her own retching. Another pair of strong hands kept her from dropping to her knees into the puddle she created. Even as she gave in to the carnage, the conscious part of her felt burning shame at having lost her composure. And before Xing and so many soldiers too, she had degraded herself, shown weakness. Her image was ruined. She'd have to be wary of veiled mockery and, "Are you all right?" The voice drew AZULA's attention, and she looked up to see Xing standing before her, his bare legs stained with specks of her vomit. AZULA blinked, and her eyes darted around to see the other soldiers regarding her with slight frowns of concern. Genuine concern. Mosey, water. Someone was guiding her away from the crowd, and a flask of water was produced before her. AZULA gingerly took the offered flask and took a mouthful of cool water to clear her mouth. A cloth was offered next, and she gladly took it, wetting it and using it to clean some of the mess from her face. I apologize for not considering the circumstances. Xing's voice came from beside her, and AZULA turned to see the boy looking at her with a slight frown. I should have met you back in camp instead of having you come out here. It is a passing weakness, she replied sharply. He only nodded slowly. I understand. We all do, Your Highness. It is not an uncommon result when witnessing the aftermath of a battle for the first time. The princess was about to reply again when Ren's voice spoke up from behind her. Yeah, don't worry about it, princess. I remember puking my guts out after my first fight. Almost ruined Captain Shina's boots when I was reporting to him. Rin finished with a soft chuckle, which was joined by several other soldiers. I held up until dinner. Someone else, Kai, she thought, added. Was fine until I thought the stew looked bad. Puked all over my squad's meals. I remember that, you bastard. It was our first warm meal for days too. More laughter, and more of them openly spoke about their own humiliations after battle. Took me 6 fights to stop retching. You're lucky. I was still puking over my kills until Mi Sha Fong. It felt surreal to AZULA. They were trying to make her feel better, show that she was no different from any of them, but there were no veiled insults, no mockery of her being no better than them. Don't worry, princess, Xing finally said. I remember keeling over and retching until I sprained my back and stomach. There's no shame here. If anything, you've done a better job at holding it in than the rest of us. She blinked at his words, and then took consolation with a careful nod. I suppose. I had not expected to be overwhelmed. If you do, Your Highness. Xing offered a reassuring smile before turning to one side. Mosey, escort Princess AZULA back to camp, so she can clean up. I'll join right after finishing up here. AZULA followed after the man in thoughtful silence, though it was interrupted when she heard the roar of fire in the distance as the rounded-up earthbenders were executed. She ignored the screams of the dying much more easily then. If anything, there was a sense of satisfaction seeing the punishment of vile treachery be enacted. One of her bodyguards didn't seem to think so, however, quickly running aside to heave loudly. AZULA simply paused and waited for the man to be done, giving him an arched brow. Feeling better? At his hurried nods, she sighed and resumed following after Mosey. Come, I've had my fill of battlefields for today. The 11th Regiment took 3 days to scrounge the battlefield before they broke camp and moved out. Old habits die hard, and Ren was right out there with the others in picking through the corpses. She pried slag metal off flesh, shook armor free from their dead hosts, and bundled up spears and swords just as if the regiment was in dire straits again. The few deaths the 11th suffered were similarly divested of their belongings, though their bodies were given a solemn cremation right afterwards. Their personal effects would be returned home with the next report to the capital. Xing had said the scavenging was a good habit to keep, since they could afford to transport the loot, and Hyung had his band of craftspeople to help restore or convert the salvaged gear. The newbies might balk at the dirty task, but vets like Rin agreed wholeheartedly with the idea. At the very least, the scavenged weapons and armor would make for good donations to the colonies they passed by. The enemy camp had already been looted clean, of course. It was one of the first things the regiment did after executing the Earthbenders, and served as good training for the newbies in what to look out for in Earth Kingdom bases. Everything that wasn't furniture was taken along, made to fit in carts. The wagons and ostrich horses left behind were the first to be claimed, followed then by food and water. Currency and little luxuries like blankets and bedrolls were next, and finally even the tents were neatly dismantled. As Colonel Li Dai practiced, Xing handed all personal trinkets like letters and drawings to the prisoners before they were released, along with a day's ration of food. It should guarantee they'd make it back to spread the word. And the old colonel hoped the return of personal artifacts would provide closure to the families of the fallen. Xing had also noted that such acts would also likely remind the Earth Kingdom peasants that the 11th might be negotiated with. That, or foment resentment and potential bans of vengeful family members, which the older colonel had already accepted as a minor risk. Rin had seen both sides before, though the former always unnerved her. Seeing grieving widows and parents quietly make way for them as they passed through villages was almost eerie. A few times she had come across shrines in the village square, built to commemorate the fallen and littered with the same trinkets the freed soldiers were allowed to take with them. She hoped the princess would come across such a shrine in her journey with the 11th. It would be good to have a royal with a mind for the realities of the front lines. It might even see fewer stupid charges and pointless defenses being given out if the young princess decided to throw her influence around. Rin really did not want to be part of any meat grinder missions at all. At least the princess patronage meant nobody would be stupid enough to send the 11th as bait in some grand stratagem. With no new prisoners to break in, the regiment marched on with respectable speed. Morale was high amongst the newbies thanks to the victory. Hyung was all smiles at the performance of the toys he built, and the princess was well impressed with her regiment overall, when she wasn't being too tired anyway. Of course, Rin should have known that the girl would take getting used to the horrors of the battlefield. Xing had quickly noticed it, unlike other things, likely thanks to his own experience. So Ren and Ping were put in charge of watching the princess at night. On the first night, after the bodyguards had reported Princess AZULA going to sleep, Rin quietly slipped in and sat by her bed, making herself comfortable and taking her own nap. Sure enough, sometime later, the captain was awoken to a disturbed rustling, and she found Princess AZULA rolling in her bedding in the dim darkness, practically drenched in sweat as she kicked and twisted. A sense of nostalgia blossomed in Rin as she reached over to grab onto the princess' hand, giving a reassuring squeeze as she cooed softly. At the same time, she also got ready to duck, just in case. At worst, at least the royal tent was supposed to be fire-resistant, and the princess flames wouldn't be as damaging as Xing's. The tent flap slid open as a bodyguard looked in, but he quietly returned to his watch as Ren shook her head at him. The gentle squeeze calmed the girl down for a moment, and Ren smiled as she felt the smaller hand squeeze back. That's already one better than Xing, at least. The moment didn't last long, though, as the grip weakened and Princess AZULA snapped awake, her mind keen enough to notice she was not alone in her tent. "Wadash, it's all right, Your Highness," Rin quickly said to calm the princess. Even in the darkness, she could make out the girl's surprised stare. "Captain, what are you doing here?" the princess hissed. "Xing thought you could use some comforting. You were having a nightmare." "I'm fine," came the immediate defensive reply. The princess silhouette shifted to study herself. "No one's saying you're not," Rin said with a nod. "But we figured you might prefer it if you didn't want to wake up alone in the dark." There was a few seconds of silence before a reply came. "What makes you think I need the company?" Still defensive, but not suspicious. "Another point better than Xing," Rin shrugged, the dim light from outside sure to outline her movement. "The soldiers sleep in groups, so they have familiar faces to wake up to, and comrades to reassure them. Your Highness is sleeping alone, in an environment you are not comfortable in. It can be an unsettling experience. And you would know that?" the princess asked, full of doubt. The captain nodded. "Of course. Xing went through the same thing." "Well, not the same. He was worse, actually." A heavy pause followed. "Xing," Rin nodded again. "After we rescued him. He was so terrified of all of us, thought us all monsters. His ordeal it scarred his mind." She found herself smiling sadly as she remembered the first days with a conscious Xing. When he slept, he was plagued with nightmares, kicking and screaming and even fire bending. Ren let out a soft sigh and felt the princess watching her raptly. So after a couple of nights, Kai decided to watch after Xing. Even when he kicked or screamed fire, Kai was there, ready to calm him down. "That worked?" came the disbelieving question. "It took a few nights, but yeah. Xing stopped screaming after his 5th night, I think. Then he eventually stopped kicking and blasting fire, and eventually he was sleeping just like everyone else. It also helped break down the boy's fear and reluctance of the regiment." Was this also a reason why Xing sent her and Ping to this task? Ren felt a smirk tug at her lips. Me and a former colleague rotated with Kai to ensure we all had enough rest looking after him. I see. Don't worry, princess. If you do not wish to be bothered, I'll leave and inform the colonel to leave you to your sleep. Rin made to get up, but the princess stopped her. "Wait, I suppose there's no harm in giving it a try, at least for a few nights." The captain didn't bother to hide her grin. "As you say, Your Highness. I know I'm not Xing, but you dash. Why do I need him here?" Princess AZULA immediately cut in, a bit too fast, a bit too insistent. Ren held back a chuckle and reached out to place a hand on the princess. "Don't worry, I'll be here through the night, all right?" Princess AZULA's hand tightened around hers, and her silhouette nodded. She kicked a bit in her sleep, but no flames were thrown about. A much better sleeper than Xing used to be. She woke up a little tired, but far less haggard than the previous nights. Ping's watch the next night proved to be less eventful, and the light-sleeping captain of the 4th Battalion was actually asleep for most of the time. Rin felt a pang of sympathy as she realized that the princess only needed company, someone to be with her. With Xing's permission, she and Ping had their tents moved right next to the princess, out of sisterly solidarity. The nightmares eventually subsided, just as it did with Xing, but the princess never dismissed Rin or Ping from their task. If anything, Princess AZULA seemed to take their presence for granted, using the nights to slowly open up to the women. She began to talk, and both captains would listen, free of judgment or advice they had no place in offering. Rin listened about the annoyances of royal court life, and how incompetent the princess' fire-bending tutors were. She learned a bit more of the royal family's dynamics, and came to understand the amount of pressure the siblings were under, with their invisible shackles of expectations. No wonder the crown prince always looked so glum. Not a single word spoken during the nights was repeated outside, not unless the princess herself brought it up. Nobody asked, nobody outwardly cared. Right, let's have a look here. A soldier of the 11th Regiment sat down, swaying gently to the rocking of the wagon. Kylan squinted as she carefully unwrapped the bandage around his waist, smiling as she saw a neat scar. Ah, looks like it's going along fine. Does it hurt anymore? And no, ma'am, the young trooper, a fresh face, stated nervously. The elderly waterbender gave a satisfied nod and reached for the jug by her side. Exerting some will, she drew out the water in the container and sent the tendril pressing against the once gaping wound. Kylan hid her amusement at the soldier's obvious discomfort at having a waterbender this close to him. Relax, lad, or you might spill your guts out again. With little effort, she channeled her chi into the water, making it glow as it went to work reknitting flesh and reconnecting severed chi paths. Despite the severity of the closed wound, the rather neat cut had made the healing process much simpler. Plus, it was only a sword wound. There wasn't any need to dig around for dirt and pebbles like the other wounded. It took a few seconds, and when the water was returned back into the jug, the scar was barely visible. How's it feel now? The soldier snapped out of his odd gaping and nodded, slowly turning left and right. Much, much better. Thank you, ma'am. He jumped off the wagon after giving a deep bow, and Kylan was once more glad that the good habits of the 11th stuck around. On the other end, Yukai was still restoring the shoulder of another soldier. It had taken Yukai, Kylan, and 2 other healers to reknit the nearly severed limb back, bone and all. Much of the time was spent cleaning the wound of dirt and debris left by an earth-bended spike. With most of the heavy lifting done, Yukai could take her time in bringing the arm back to full function. Kylan smiled. The former novice had learned a lot in her travels as a prisoner of the 11th. A far better fate than languishing in chains in the Fire Nation outpost, for sure. Her mother was in another wagon, meant for general prisoners. Yuka was far less skittish now than when Kylan had first met her, having grown accustomed to the men of the 11th, both soldiers and prisoners, and trusting her captors with her safety almost as fully as everyone else did. The relationship between prisoners and soldiers of the 11th was an unorthodox arrangement. The old gentlemanly Dai had been courteous to a fault, and Kylan still felt it a great loss that they had to meet as enemies. That the humble warrior had succumbed to time was the biggest shame. She was sure Li Dai had a decade or 2 more to him. At least his successor, his grandson, was picking up where he left off. Xing was a good kid, good enough that if not for the damned war, Kylan would regret not having any granddaughters to introduce him to. He might be haunted or outright cursed by the spirits, and supposedly been the mastermind behind many prisoners' capture. But the boy had been nothing but friendly to them, going out of his way to see to their needs. He smuggled in food and other necessities when sponge-brained Sherluo rescinded all decency for the prisoners, and Kylan was fairly certain that he'd been the one to deliver Yuka's and Yukai's revenge. Fire Nation barracks don't just burst into flame all at once. And much as Yama denies it, Kylan herself would willingly admit that she found herself rather fond of the boy, if not the 11th Regiment as a whole. Coming to terms that her home might not exist anymore had made her attachment easier. With nowhere to go, the fire-bending soldiers around Kylan were ironically the closest thing to home for her now, and probably for the others as well. They wouldn't have stuck around otherwise. Kylan remembered the eve before Sherluo's disaster. With the bulk of the regiment marching out, and the camp barely guarded. Xing, barely walking straight from the lashings he'd endured, had brought in one of the camp's cooks into the prisoner's yard. The healer remembered the shock she felt at seeing the boy get down on all fours, pressing his head against the ground. "Honored prisoners, it has been an honor in meeting you. I apologize on my family's behalf for any mistreatment done to you." Even Yama remained silent as Xing slowly raised his head and proffered the keys to the shackles. "Me and the others will leave shortly, to help my brothers and sisters however we can. Li Ming here will free you. I ask that you take her with you and protect her as you leave." "Xing," the girl said, staring at him in surprise. The boy gave her a weak smile. "You'll be safe with them. If you encounter the Earth Kingdom, you can say we forced you to work for us." "What are you going on about, boy?" Yama finally demanded after snapping out of his surprise. Xing didn't answer as he got up on shaky feet and gave a sad, resigned smile, the kind given by warriors knowingly going to their deaths. Kylan remembered that smile most of all, and eyes that were heavy with emotion. I hope, if you encounter us as you escape," he had said, "that you will spare us the cruelties that we have inflicted on you." Kylan remembered herself and several others gasping as they realized what the boy meant, what he intended to do. They tried to stop him, of course. Yama almost called the guards on them with how loud he was getting. But Xing left, and with him were the remainder of the old 11th's personnel. Guards, cooks, quartermaster. "Only call Sherlaw's men remain here," he remarked before he left. "You do not have to be considerate for our sake. I suggest waiting for a while." The guards had been given a heavy dinner. The surprise lingered long enough that the prisoners were arguing amongst themselves for a while after Xing left. Li Ming had also snuck out shortly after to seek the people that took her in. In the end, Yama and Kylan took the reins of their respective groups, and they broke out together. The camp was littered with sleeping guards and panicking camp followers. The breakout was unobstructed, though everyone agreed to spend a few minutes to bury Sherlaw's over-extravagant tent and flood it with stuffed waterbend out of the latrines. They sought the cover of the forest first, waiting for dawn before a vote was cast. Waterbenders and earthbenders moved to the front lines in silence, learned from their captors. It had been a bloodbath for the 11th Regiment. Kylan saw the brave men and women barely holding the line after the first reckless charge had failed. Scores of Sherlaw's fresh reinforcements were dead in massive holes, and scores more were crushed or impaled from earthbender attacks. The veterans of the 11th were organizing a retreat, but from the treetops, Kylan could tell that they were just moments away from being surrounded. She saw Mosey holding onto his stomach with one arm, while the other desperately fended off spears and swords with flames. Kindly Chia fell, impaled by several jagged spikes as she bought time for her soldiers to drag the severely wounded back. Kai was furiously fighting above Ren's fallen form. The captain and his lieutenant separated from the others. Then Xing came, and his white flames burned a path through. Kylan felt hope surge in the wounded veterans, and in that moment her heart was with them. He blazed brightly, the shock of his violent arrival allowing for the camp followers who had followed him to come in and pull out the fallen. Yet it was clear that Xing was not at his best. His flames sputtered, though they still reaped a fearsome reward with each gout. He was soon covered in fresh wounds as he fought towards his isolated friends, his brothers and sisters. Xing fought with the defiance that earned the 11th its reputation, seemingly content to either die for his family or die with them. Kylan remembered the hotness in her eyes as tears freely streamed down her cheeks. She remembered exchanging a look with Yama and seeing the outrage in the grizzled general's eyes. A silent nod was all that was exchanged between waterbenders and earthbenders, and they quickly left the safety of the forest to act. To save the host they grown to respect, the boy they had grown to be fond of. Yama jumped off the tree and landed solidly on both feet, sending a surge of earth that erected a massive wall around the survivors of the 11th. With a push from the other earthbenders, the wall expanded, forcing the confused Earth Kingdom army back. Kylan used the time to guide her fellow waterbenders to draw on the water around all them, squeezing it out of the trees and grass, dragging it out of the ground, draining it from the very air. It was very little water for so much work, but it was more than enough to create an obscuring mist. The opportunity was made, and the former prisoners hurried to help their former captors. Such was their familiarity that the surviving veterans did not question Yama's appearance and orders to follow him. Kylan recalled that she had to treat Xing on the spot, as the boy was both bleeding and freezing to death. Seeing just how many of the 11th had survived, how many more would perish from grievous wounds. It was horrible, she remembered feeling, almost as bad as losing family. "Elder, are you all right?" Yukai's voice snapped Kylan out of her dark reminiscing, and she flicked aside a stray tear. "Yes, dear. Just thinking, that's all. Are you done?" "Yes, Elder. It will be time for lunch soon." The aged healer gave a nod, and then let out a heavy sigh as she glanced to the front of the convoy, where she imagined the princess was riding. The 11th has lost much. Xing has lost much. Hopefully the girl would be a boon to this unconventional family. Less than a week after their first battle, the 11th Regiment came across their first Earth Kingdom village since the princess joined them. It was a small, quiet thing, somehow untouched by the war despite its proximity. Orders were passed up and down the line to remind the troops to behave. They might be in enemy territory, but that did not give anyone reason to be utter shits about it. Kai didn't have to worry so much about his command, since the 1st Battalion was made up entirely of seasoned veterans. He used the opportunity instead to coordinate with the scouts as they began to stalk deeper north. News of General Wenli's heinous behavior was picking up speed, it seems, as the whispers were encroaching into Qinbao's settlements. Already some of the more far-reaching scouts were sending back hints of outposts being quietly abandoned by their Earth Kingdom garrison, and approached villages begging for mercy from their inevitable invaders. Even this village was in a similar state of worry. The regiment's arrival was welcomed by a terrified headwoman and a small group of fidgeting villagers. No surprise that it was made up mostly of women and the elderly, though a few haggard-looking men could be seen as well. Probably deserters, or those who were let go, judging by the distinct fear in their eyes. Kai and his own gaggle of officers and guards had followed alongside Xing, Mozi and Koshi's team to meet with the villagers. He felt some admiration as a number of the civvies showed obvious signs of fear, but steeled themselves rather than flee. As they drew closer, the captain spied the buildings, and then studied the group again. The chances of an ambush were not high, but not too low either. No doubt Koshi was thinking the same thing, as he and his group of overprotective psychopaths were just a step or two from smothering their colonel. A reasonable precaution, despite how much Kai found it amusing. All it takes is some overreacting village kid with more courage than sense to foul things up. They came to a stop at a weak spear throws away from the villagers, and Xing began with a sharp parade salute. The rustling of more than a dozen armored figures following after him definitely rattled the reception party. Xing wasted no time in putting on his hardened soldier in a boy voice. "Good day. I am Colonel Xing of the Fire Nation's 11th Regiment. I am here to secure your cooperation as we use the road that runs through your home. Rest assured that we will not cause any harm or disturbance to your people, so long as none is given to us first." Kai fought to keep back a smirk at the wide eyes of the head woman as they snapped onto Xing, after initially fixing her wary gaze on Mozi. The woman regained her composure with a steadying breath and hushed the rising anxious whispers behind her. We can't stop you, can we?" she asked rhetorically. "I'll inform the others to get out of your way." She paused, frowning as she seemed conflicted about something. Finally, the head woman settled for sighing audibly. "Just I hope you mean what you say, and leave in peace." Xing nodded sharply, his voice steely. "If any of my men or women are found to be misbehaving, point them out to us. I will personally deal with it." It was rather amusing seeing the old men especially reel back from the confident declaration. The deserters too were busy whispering fearfully to those around them. The regiment began to march through the village, and Kai had his lieutenants keep watch at various points along the line. He himself led a small group of soldiers to reinforce the princess escorts. Is it truly wise to leave them be? Kai heard her asking Xing, who had been summoned to join her. The boy was riding just beside her, the still unnamed mongoose lizard keeping pace with the princess' own mount. The reptile will probably go unnamed, until Xing and the regiment as a whole can ever get over their old habits, and the fighting goes well enough that nobody is to resort to making meals out of their mounts. So long as they do not cause us any problems, villages like these are rarely worth the time to purge, Your Highness, Xing replied almost lazily. There's always bound to be survivors somewhere, and forcing them into a situation that incentivizes them to fight back can lead to unpredictable results. And the last thing anyone wants is being part in creating a reverse Xing, Kai added silently in his mind. A vengeful, brilliant, Fire-bending orphans spared by the spirits had kept the 11th through bloody and unlikely victory to bloody and unlikely victory. A vengeful, brilliant earthbending orphan? Or spirits be kind, orphans? Kai did not want that on his conscience or his trail. I see, came the princess' unconvinced reply, but she seemed happy enough to leave it at that. Contrary to what many might think, princess, these smaller settlements are rarely the source of resistance. So long as we leave them alone, the news of our victories and the villagers' imagination are often enough to keep their heads down. Having deserters return to spread the tales often helps with that. It was mildly amusing to Kai that Xing took on some of Colonel Li Dai's tone when he adopted a lecturing voice. Equally amusing was the attention Princess AZULA gave him, despite the barely passable courtesy he was addressing her. It is often when visible, solid action is taken on them that they rise up. A garrison commander feeling like he has to throw his weight around, or a passing army deciding that they are bored. When they experience the ordeals themselves, the villagers' resentment and hate at something so close and personal to them is often good fuel to spark resource-wasting resistance. The princess was frowning at the words, but clearly thinking it through instead of preparing to dismiss it. No surprise, seeing how smart Princess AZULA was. She'd no doubt figure out what Kai had after the old colonel had taken some effort to enlighten him. That it's those occupying garrisons that leave the surrounding settlements alone that see the least amount of partisan activity. It's a non-zero chance, but having a lower and less severe incident rate means we can afford lighter garrisons. Treat them no differently from how they were being treated before we came, or better yet, treat them better than that by lightening taxes and putting an end to conscription. And they'll be far less of a problem to us than they are to the Earth Kingdom if we let them retake those settlements. Kai tried not to snort as he heard the words. It was almost an exact quote to what the old man once said, which means, punish them appropriately if they act against us, but treat them like a friendly colony, and they'll eventually be behaving like one. There it was, Colonel Li Dai's ending note. It was good to know that Xing carried those lessons with him. Hopefully it'd stick with the princess far better than it did for the generals and commanders long ago. Tensely peaceful as the march was going, it felt somewhat inevitable to Kai that a ruckus was caused somewhere down the line. The captain followed the yelling into a cluster of houses, and found a squad of Hans standing rather worriedly at a safe distance, while Mosey stood between his angry girlfriend and a group of rather pissed-off women. See what you're doing, you tarts. I knew it was too dangerous for him to be sent out here. Li Ming yelled as she grabbed tightly onto Mosey's arm and possessively tugged him towards her. The poor lieutenant colonel was doing his level best to calm both parties down, but was being pointedly ignored by them. The good soldier asked to buy food, so we're just going to show him to our warehouse, one woman replied with venomous sweetness, the fingers on one hand dancing along Mosey's shoulder. You're clearly overreacting here, girlie. Kai ran a hand down his face. For heaven's sake, Mosey. He stomped over with a huff, drawing the women's attention. Li Ming took the opportunity to drag her proper boyfriend out of the way. Right, ladies. Thank you for your cooperation, the captain decisively said. I will handle it from here while the lieutenant colonel sees to more important matters, like figuring out how to stop attracting Earth Kingdom girls simply by breathing. Seriously, they should have expected this. It was Xing, Kai, and everyone else's fault for forgetting. The women looked affronted, and then outright pined as they watched their reason to spread their legs get dragged off by Li Ming and the Han squad. Kai bit back a curse before he put on his civilian-friendly smile and braced himself. So, madams, care to guide me to your warehouses to review the food you can sell us? Oh, well, you see. I forgot, the grains had gone bad, I'm sorry. Apologies, think I mistook branches for tubers. My mistake, I was thinking of fertilizer, not food. The lackluster responses before the villagers scattered were expected, but no less soul-crushing. Kai left the place with his equally annoyed men and very puzzled women to return to oversee the march. He ran into Wei Kong and Ruffin midway through, whose looks of concern were quickly replaced by confusion. What happened? The wiry Ruffin asked. I thought one of us might have dashed. Damn you, Mosey. Kai simply groaned, and the other captains immediately took his meaning. Li Ming was there, so she was putting up an aggressive resistance. Both captains, and the veterans close enough to hear, let out a collective sigh. The commanders went up the line as one displeased group, and found Mosey being berated by Run and Ping. The former was smacking him over the back of his head, while the latter was comfortingly patting Li Ming on the back. "For heaven's sake, Mosey, can't you freaking turn it off?" Ping scolded. One of the rare times the usually smiling woman was frowning disapprovingly at one of her own. Despite the difference in rank, the man seemed like a teen being caught by his aunties. "I told you, I don't know what happened." Ren snorted as she rolled her eyes. Yeah, you showed up, and they started loosening their dresses, right? At least this time, you didn't have to fight your way out." She caught sight of Kai and the others, and as one, the captains shook their heads. "Damn you, Mosey," came the general sentiment, after reporting the incident to Xing, who could only shake his head thanks to the presence of royalty. The rest of the march went on without further issues. A general reminder was put up among the officers to ensure that the lieutenant colonel's future civilian interactions be heavily regulated. But that was about it. They came across more meek villages and a couple of abandoned ones. And between them there was only one incident of brash young earthbenders deciding to put up a fight. The boys were barely hiding in the thatched rooftops, and an annoyed Xing had allowed the captains to decide among themselves who got the honor of handling the youths. Weikong won, so he and a select number of non-benders quickly snuck around and summarily brought down the would-be ambushes, kicking and wailing before Xing and their fellow villagers. Normally, the punishment for such an act is to completely sack and raze the place, and put everyone here to the sword, Xing told the pleading villagers in an unamused tone. "But we're on a tight schedule, and I'll leave the options to you. I kill the boys right now, or you hand over half of the hidden reserves I know you Earth Kingdom villages have." To their credit, the civvies did not try to argue, particularly since the wannabe partisans were children of the more prominent residents. The regiment marched out with a new wagon brimming with extra food. Of course, Xing was just happy to get another chassis for his Flammenwerfers. The 11th were about 1/3 into their journey to Qinbao when they encountered a familiar face. The scouts returned with bright smiles, and it spread to the higher officers when they heard the news. Xing went out with Kai and Run, along with a suitable escort of course, and found a rickety cart slowly trudging along the middle of the dusty dirt road away from them. Even from afar, the contents of the cart betrayed the likely identity of its owner. The soldiers quietly closed the distance and got around the cart, and sure enough, a weathered man in a turban was straining as he pushed his cart along by a worn handlebar. "Hello again, good merchant." Xing's greeting startled the man to the point where the man almost tipped the cart and its precious contents forwards. He recovered, but his eyes quickly boggled as he took in the sight of the armored soldiers around him. Despite the chainmail obscuring their faces, clearly the merchant recognized them. "You," he pointed accusingly, and then looked to his goods and quickly backed himself protectively towards his cart. "I don't trade with Fire Nation ruffians." The cabbage merchant's courage was admirable, but Kai was just glad to see him again. Xing probably was too. "I recall we paid a premium for your stock the last time," the young colonel commented with a tilt of his head. "Earth Kingdom currency as well. You took them while I was asleep," the turbaned man retorted. "We left payment, and not to mention they had saved him from a very desperate bandit attack. They must have been as starving as the regiment to hit a vegetable vendor, and helped to fix up his cart after dragging it back to their camp. That's not the point. I was supposed to head to Omashadash and make a lower profit by selling your cabbages there?" Xing interrupted, full of amusement. Even considering different trading values, a garrison's pay was surely more than enough compensation for a cart of cabbages. The merchant sputtered and finally huffed in exasperation. "Well, I'm not going to sell any more cabbages to you lot." Xing's head tilted again. "Oh, it's a shame. I was looking forward to cabbages." He paused for a moment before shrugging. "Well, no matter. It was good seeing you again. May your ventures be prosperous." The soldiers all gave a salute with their colonel before they turned to leave. It only took a couple of seconds, and wait! Kai and some of his comrades had to stifle their chuckles as the cabbage merchant called out to them. I suppose I can sell you some cabbages." They parted ways peacefully, with each soldier carrying a head of cabbage on the way back, and the merchant walking off with a hefty pouch of currency. Kai was sure he was not the only one wearing a smile underneath his metal veil. It was more than just the cabbages. After they absconded with the cabbages the last time, Kai and Xing had shadowed the merchant, just in case, and had seen the man not complaining as much as he did now at the loss of his cabbages. More importantly, They also witnessed the man purposely giving the wrong directions to one of the Earth Kingdom patrols on the regiment's trail. And only after that did the cabbage merchant notice the pile of yuans left in his cart. The merchant had done good by the regiment back then, likely saved them from a tough encirclement. It was a debt Kai and the others would remember, one of several unexpected good deeds received from the people of a supposedly hostile kingdom. That it didn't involve a girl, and Mosey made it all the more impressive. Once they returned to the loitering regiment, Xing ordered that they would be setting camp for the night, never mind that it was only late afternoon. The newbies could use the practice of working under the sun. And besides, the cabbage merchant had refused the offer to travel along with the regiment that was sure to overtake him. Giving him the road for the day was the least they could do. It didn't take long for scouts to report sightings of another army. An army from Chunbao looked to intercept the regiment, one that was smaller than the 7,000 the 11th had fought earlier. 4,000 strong, all enlisted. Xing muttered in the command wagon, and Rin shared his concern. Think they could be dressing up their levies? Kai suggested, earning many doubtful shaking heads. Sungo was clear that they were moving in good order. Mosey countered. Even the least trained Earth Kingdom soldier should have more discipline than conscripted farmers. Rin had to agree, and voiced her own thoughts on the matter. They have at least 4 cavalry companies. Someone's taking us seriously. Is that force really a threat? Princess AZULA asked, no longer hiding her ignorance behind imperial aloofness. Xing answered with a weary nod. The Earth Kingdom almost always has levy elements in their armies. The cheap manpower was partly what allowed them to keep the war going, from what I've been told. The boy gave the princess a faint smirk. Makes them slower, though, and poor discipline means breaking them might disorganize the rest of their forces. As you have seen yourself, Your Highness. The princess caught on quickly. So they are doing away with levies for the sake of better organization. Run and the other officers nodded like proud tutors, while Xing only gave a pleased smile. Discipline and morale can make a lot of difference on the battlefield, princess. Not having to see and hear fleeing comrades around you means you'll stay in formation for quite a while longer. Not having to march with a disorganized mob means you can act more decisively. Ah, he was using his lecturing tone again. Best nip it before he accidentally got on the princess' nerves. Assuming they're competent, the princess noted before Run could step in. That drew more nods from the officers. Unfortunately, it seems that this enemy is to some degree, Rin said. Xing sighed in agreement. They use their cavalry to scare off our scouts from getting a better look. So that alone puts the commander leagues above the other commanders we've faced before. And they stopped their cavalry from chasing down the scouts, Rin pointed out. That kind of restraint either meant a paranoid commander, or one that fought the 11th before. The others seemed to share the same thought, frowning as they pondered. Think it'll be a familiar face leading them? Ping asked, and after a few seconds Xing shrugged. Maybe. Probably. Or it could be someone in the Earth Kingdom finally read the battle reports. The 11th did not break camp the following day to try gaining further ground. Instead, the defenses were strengthened, and the troops were set to battle readiness. Sure enough, the Earth Kingdom's banners could soon be seen across the plains, and the scouts returned in the late afternoon to bring rather sour news. Rather than taking the fight to the 11th, the enemy earthbenders seemed to be digging in. There's trenches being carved out, and judging from how they're organizing their tents, we'll see walls up by nightfall. They're building a fort, Xing half-asked with annoyance. Unfortunately, that was the case, as by dusk a primitive but still imposing set of walls rose to bar the 11th's path into Qinbao, an earth-bended fort for cavalry to harass from. Rin found herself scowling at the thought of it. The only thing making the coming fight close to possible at all was that Earth Kingdom cavalry were entirely made up of non-benders, due to earth-bending requiring contact with the ground. On the plus side, the enemy was sending a delegation to parley, and it was Ren's turn to join Xing to meet the enemy. True enough, as both groups met under the setting sun, Rin somewhat recalled the stern face of the officer who actually bothered to dismount and offer a respectful salute. Xing returned the salute, his voice hinting at some amusement. Ah, Somsak, you were a captain, am I right? Congratulations on your promotion. Colonel Somsak nodded curtly, though his retinue wore a mix of wariness and puzzlement. Congratulations on your own promotion as well. I see the rumors are true then. I admit, it is good to see the defiant 11th still operating. The man's face scrunched up into a bitter scowl. To fail only because of dismal leadership. I appreciate the sentiment, the younger colonel replied with a tinge of terseness. I suppose we should start clarifying the coming rules of engagement. Somsak sighed. Much as I owe your regiment for my freedom, I have my orders. And I am sure you will not be dissuaded from yours. He took in a breath and exhaled audibly before continuing. I can guarantee that I will not pursue any of yours that flees from us, and any prisoners taken will not be abused. Likewise, any who surrender before the 11th will be treated with respect. I have no doubt about that, the Earth Kingdom colonel said with a final salute before remounting his ostrich horse. Throughout the entire exchange, his guards and officers did not shed their apprehension or confusion. They were probably expecting threats and heavy-handed negotiations. Their expressions didn't change for the better at Xing's last words. As you were a good guest, I promise that you will not need to fear the 11th slitting the throats of your men tonight. Should we brace for a night attack? Mosey asked as they walked back to camp. Xing shook his head. Doubt he'll be generous enough. He's been with us long enough to know how we handle such things. And his fort would be heavily defended from our own raids. Rin mused. But her little brother let out a soft chuckle. What? He would, wouldn't he? If I remember right, we captured Somsak during a skirmish. And he never saw how we raided. He would have heard from the others, Mosey reasonably countered. Xing's vindictive smirk was annoying enough for Run to almost want to wipe it off his face. How many prisoners did we take back from a San operation? I thought we agreed you should stay in camp and act more like a colonel, Mosey immediately replied. Koshi broke his silence to agree as well. Mosey's right. Your place is to strategize and command, not lead breakthroughs and raids. The boy had the audacity to turn to them with a pleading, almost pouting look. Mosey and Koshi almost relented, but Rin stepped in to smack the colonel lightly over his head. No, you're a colonel, Xing. We need you to act like it, so the idiots back in the capital don't see any reason to send in a replacement. Xing finally sighed in defeat. Fine, then I'll guide the raid from a distance, enough to start the San. The officers exchanged glances amongst themselves before agreeing to the compromise. Koshi, you drag the colonel back to camp if you have to after the opening strike, Mosey instructed. And I'll inform the princess, Rin added with a grin. Just to make sure you have someone waiting for you back in camp. The adults happily ignored their superior officers' grumbles as they reached camp. Preparations was quickly made for the night attack, with Kai's 1st Battalion and Ping's 4th Battalion assigned to guard the camp while the others swapped out their brigandines for lighter gray and blue gambesons. Spears were replaced with war cleavers and axes, while Nap the clay jars were wrapped in wool and hide to stop them from clinking about. Rin felt a little giddy as she hid more chiseled daggers in her sleeves and belt. It was the first night raid in what? A year. And it would be a San at that. At least it'd be easier for the newbies, since they needn't worry too much about sneaking about. Princess AZULA was given a general overview of what would happen, and her guards were told to ensure that she did not leave her tent at night. Rin felt so tempted to prod the princess when she heard that Xing would be taking part as well. The girl probably didn't realize how her ever so slightly widened eyes and sudden stiffness gave her worries away. To be young and dumb again. The 3 battalions took an early dinner and a last-minute briefing by Xing, and then the captains. The young colonel projected false confidence well enough, Rin thought. The priority is to close in on the enemy's strongpoint without being noticed. This should be easy enough considering your training. The closer we get, the greater our advantage. If we're found out too early, the idiot or idiots that screwed things up for everyone else will lead the charge. Xing's smirk told everyone that he was only half joking. If they somehow survive, they'll be put on prisoner hospitality duty for a month, and they'll have to tend to General Yama's needs. Groans and chuckles broke out at that, but Run wasn't part of it. The old badger mole knew how to act like a spoiled child when he saw the opportunity to, and having to wait on him hand and foot can be an ordeal in itself. They waited for night to come and the moon to rise higher in the sky before shuffling out of the camp. The scouts of the 11th served as the vanguard, keeping the advance clear of potential Earth Kingdom scouts. The battalions fanned out in a loose formation, keeping low as they quietly ran across the plains. Xing was at the back of the formation, with Koshi and his team stoically lugging the soot-covered Hobbitson along with them and somehow keeping up. The first Earth Kingdom spotters were encountered and swiftly taken out, Sungo's men dragging the incapacitated scouts further back to be bound and gagged. Rin had a glimpse of their unconscious forms and felt some sympathy at the fresh-faced prisoners. They were too young and too outclassed by the wily survivalists of the 11th, to the point that none of them had been outright killed to maintain silence. Rin kept running in a half-crouch, quietly pleased with her men and women who no longer huffed and whined as their legs and backs were put in an awkward pose. The whole formation froze as one when a distinct cricket chirp sounded. Thankfully, nobody was stupid enough to drop to the ground and rattle their gear. It took a while, but Rin eventually spied the shadowy forms of another Earth Kingdom patrol on the left flank. 6 brave men who believed in their night vision enough to not use torches. The shadows around them swallowed all 6 of them up, and the captain heard only the softest of grunts as the 11th's scouts once more proved their skill. They ran and froze their way across the plains, and the pinprick lights of the fort drew closer, and eventually grew into larger bulbs of radiance. Ren risked standing a little taller to draw her battalion's attention, and then led them off to one side. Weikong took the other side, while Rufin's soldiers settled in front with Xing. As they got into position, more crickets chirped in the peculiar rhythm, signaling more sentries being silenced. These ones would only be dragged aside instead of taken back. The night watch on the fort obliviously patrolled their walls, the fort's lightning and their own torches hindering their vision into the gloom beyond. Nostalgia crept into Run as she knelt on one knee and apprehensively raised a hand and kept her eyes on the guards above. After waiting for 4 passes, she tapped on her fingers, and a cricket song sent her status back to Xing. The cacophony of insect chirping actually caused the guards on the wall to pause in confusion, for what it was worth. A shame that they realized too late that something was up, because shortly after that there was a flare of white fire to her side, followed closely by a deafening explosion as Xing fired a metal ball into the fort. Confused shouting followed soon after a hole was punched through the earthen walls. Even as the clamor within the base rose, Xing sent off a second shot that further expanded on the initial breach. Judging from the sounds, the 3rd round caused that section of wall to fully crumble down. Ren's heart began quickening as she waited. The guards on the walls were all drawn to the front, shouting at their fellows below. No doubt they only saw Xing and his bodyguards legging it back to camp, as a trail of Earth Kingdom soldiers streamed out to chase after them. No less than a score of them made it past the protective glow of their fort's lanterns and braziers before Rufin and his battalion. From where she knelt, it looked as if darkness rose up and swallowed the Earth Kingdom men and their torches before surging into the light to devour those men still streaming out. The fort's residents' cries of alarm quickly became tinged with panic. Now, a scout whispered loudly from behind her, and Rin took the man's word as an order. Rin lowered her hand and stood up, ignoring the aches in her back and legs as she immediately got into a firebending stance. The other firebenders under her command did as well, while the non-benders got on their bellies and crawled closer to the walls. As one, the firebenders slowly gathered their inner flames, free from any unwanted attention. Well, most unwanted attention. A few cries of alarm told Run that they'd been spotted, but the scouts attached to her battalion were quickly on the case, silencing the alarmed sentries with precise arrow shots. "Don't stop," Rin hissed behind her, in case that scene had caused her firebenders to falter. "Ready the flames." Rin channeled and intensified the chi circulating in her for several seconds before finally unleashed it onto a point on the wall. The others followed after her, letting out a concentrated volley of fire into the same point. Such was the torrent of fire that as the barrage blasted a hole into rock and dirt, that section of wall was impossible to look at directly. Another blast could be heard echoing from the other end of the fort, signaling Weikong's battalion achieving the same result. Rin didn't wait for the smoke to clear before calling for a charge. If the walls hadn't been breached yet, the smoke would cover them while they rectified the issue. If the walls had been breached, then the smoke would come in handy masking their assault. Thankfully, the concentrated fire was more than enough to blow a hole large enough to accommodate 4 soldiers. Ren was the first to leap past the breach, and unluckily for her she found herself in the soldiers' sleeping tents. The food and water would be on the other side then. Ah, damn it. 2nd Battalion. Burn everything. Rin began to hurl fire into the tents, not caring if they were occupied or not. It'd be the soldiers' own damned fault if they let themselves burn to death from a simple flame. Behind her, Her firebenders did the same, spreading fire throughout the flammable wood and cloth surfaces of the fort's interior. At the same time, the non-benders with their axes and cleavers rushed between the fires to engage the stunned enemy. To their credit, most of the Earth Kingdom troops were still in armor. Unfortunately for them, they did not sleep with their weapons. Many were cut down as they tried to pick up their spears and swords just outside their burning tents, the raiders ruthlessly capitalizing on that moment of vulnerability. Those with weapons found themselves quickly overwhelmed, as warcleavers hacked spear shafts apart for others to stab and chop down its wielder. Once they secured a beachhead, Ren took a second to feel for a breeze before she quickly reached for the clay jar behind her. "Naphtha!" she bellowed, hurling the thing as far into the camp as she could before blasting at it with a quick flick of her wrists. The clay jar exploded, and its rancid contents scattered and ignited. More jars filled the air, and the firebenders took the time to shoot each down. In mere seconds, the area before her was filled by a thick cloud of noxious smoke that wafted almost perfectly perpendicular from the battalion. The coughing and heaving of Earth Kingdom troops could be heard from within the smog, which served as reference points for the firebenders to direct their fire. Onwards! Burn it all! Ren led her men and women deeper into the center of the fort, leaving behind a forest of smoke pillars from burning tents and men. Fire was spilling all over the place. It almost looked like dawn was rising if one squinted hard enough. To her right, she saw the breach, and the Earth Kingdom troops fighting desperately to keep Ruffin's people from entering it. To her left, another group of barely mustered soldiers was hurrying down, stumbling to a stop as they encountered Ren's battalion. The captain didn't need to give the order. Simply throwing a bolt of fire in their leader's way was enough to get her own troops rushing at the reinforcements. Ren dove into the fray, daggers drawn and already stabbing deep into the chest of an earthbender before he could kick up a lump of rock. A quick jab fouled the strike of an enemy soldier trying to slash at one of her own, as well as setting the fool on fire. Ren winced as she felt the scrape of an almost avoided spear thrust from the side, and she exhaled to give herself a precious inch before the weapon was pulled back. The attacker was immolated by someone else before she could retaliate. So instead, the captain quickly drew another pair of daggers and jammed them into the face of an enemy officer. Probably a captain, but she couldn't really tell from the sleepwear. She lashed out with fiery punches and kicks, as well as daggers, until eventually the enemy group broke and routed. With the distraction gone, Ren redirected her people into the backs of the breached defenders. A volley of fire was only released when the Earth Kingdom soldiers noticed them about halfway into the charge. The fight that ensued was brief, and Ren's and Ruffin's troops met among the dead and surrendered enemy. They were about to advance back into the fort, but then a call was heard through the smoke. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Weikong's voice, and that of someone else. The Earth Kingdom colonel. "Ah, shit!" Ruffin cursed and Ren empathized. The bastard got the enemy commander. Bastard's gonna be preening after this, she muttered, earning her colleague's annoyed nod. The night attack ended as both sides ceased hostilities. A somewhat scarred Weikong smugly led the defeated colonel with an axe lightly pressed against his neck towards his fellow captains. Colonel Somsak's ash and soot-covered face looked more resigned than anything. His similarly messy retinue was far more devastated at their loss. "I surrender," the colonel simply said, and the night raid was a runaway success.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.